The bag hit the stone floor before Lyra even had a chance to set it down properly. One of the straps caught on the door frame, and the whole thing lurched sideways, sending her medical kit sliding across the polished corridor with a sound that echoed far too loudly in a place this quiet. No one came to help her. She had not expected anyone to. She had been told quite plainly that her posting to Caldenmere Stronghold was not a reward, it was a reassignment, the kind that came with a folder of instructions and very few answers. She had read the instructions twice on the journey north. The answers, she decided, would have to come later. She picked up the bag, she adjusted the strap, she walked on. The stronghold was older than she had imagined. Not old in the way of crumbling things, but old in the way of things that had survived too much and simply refused to stop. The stone walls were thick and gray and completely without decoration, at least in this wing. The torches burned steadily in iron brackets. The floors were swept clean. Everything smelled faintly of pine resin and cold mountain air, and Lyra found, against her better judgment, that she liked it. A woman named Corin met her at the end of the corridor. Corin was somewhere in her 50s, with the kind of posture that had been earned through decades of moving through formal spaces without ever relaxing her spine. She wore a dark green coat with silver buttons, and she looked at Lyra the way a person looks at a package they were told to expect, but were not especially excited about receiving. "You are the physician's assistant," Corin said, not a question. "Lyra Voss," Lyra said, "yes. The head physician is in the East Wing. You will not be stationed there." Corin turned and began walking before Lyra had fully processed this information. "Your office is in the North Corridor, near the King's study." Lyra followed. "Near the King's study," she repeated. "Adjacent, technically. Is that usual?" Corin paused at a turn in the corridor and looked back at her. "It is what was arranged." "Who arranged it?" The pause that followed was not long, but it was precise. "It is what was arranged," Corin said again and turned the corner. Lyra followed without asking again. The North Corridor was quieter than the rest. The torches here burned slightly lower, as if someone had trimmed the wicks to encourage a calmer light. The stone floor was covered along its center by a long, narrow rug in a faded shade of blue, and the walls on either side held no decorations except, at even intervals, small iron rings that might once have held lanterns or something else entirely. Corin stopped at a door on the left. It was a solid door, well fitted, with a plain iron handle. She produced a key from her coat pocket and unlocked it. "Your office," she said. "Also your room for now. The quarters wing is being repainted. You will move in 3 weeks." Lyra stepped inside. The room was small, not uncomfortably small, but honest about its size. There was a desk along one wall, a narrow bed along another, a window that faced north and showed a thin sliver of gray mountain sky, and a shelf that was currently empty. A second door on the far wall was closed and fitted with no handle on this side. "That door connects to the study," Corin said. "It is locked from the other side. Do not knock on it." "I wasn't planning to." "Good." Corin set the key on the desk. "Meals are in the Great Hall at set hours. I will have someone bring you the schedule. You begin duties with the physician's unit in the morning. Report to the East Wing at first bell." She moved toward the door. "One more thing." She stopped and turned, and for a moment her expression shifted into something that was almost personal. Almost. "There is a bird," she said. "A gray parrot. He belongs to the king. He goes where he likes. If you find him in your room, put him out the window. Do not feed him from your plate. Do not attempt to handle him." She paused. "And do not teach him anything." Lyra stared at her. "Teach him anything?" "Words, songs, instructions, anything." Corin's face returned to its previous careful neutrality. "He is not your bird. He does not need your influence." And then she was gone, and Lyra was alone in the small room with the empty shelf and the locked door and the mountain sky in the window, wondering what exactly she had walked into. She unpacked slowly. It was something she had learned to do over years of postings to unfamiliar places. Take your time with the unpacking. Let the room get used to you before you try to get used to it. She set her medical texts on the shelf in the order she always set them. She placed her personal kit on the left side of the desk and her writing materials on the right. She put her extra coat on the hook beside the door and her boots under the bed. She sat on the edge of the bed and looked around. The room was quiet, not peaceful quiet, holding its breath quiet. Through the wall on her right she heard nothing. The locked door had no gap at its base, no sound came from under it. The study beyond was either empty or occupied by someone who moved like water. She told herself it was almost certainly empty. The Alpha King, by all reports, spent most of his time in the war chamber or the Great Hall or wherever it was that kings spent their time, not in a study adjacent to an assistant physician's temporary quarters. She told herself this. She was not entirely convinced. She slept badly the first night, which was ordinary for a first night in a new place. In the morning she dressed and found the Great Hall and ate quickly and went to the East Wing and introduced herself to head physician Warwick, a narrow man with tired eyes and an extremely organized desk, who shook her hand briefly and assigned her to 3 patients and sent her off. The work was straightforward. A soldier with a healing fracture in his arm, a young kitchen worker with a persistent rash, and an elderly woman from the village who had been brought in 2 days prior with a fever that was already breaking. Lyra checked the fracture, changed the rash treatment, confirmed the fever was indeed retreating, wrote her notes, and returned to her own office by mid-morning. She set her notebook on the desk. There was a flower on the desk. She had not put it there. It was small, pale yellow, pressed flat and dry, as if it had been kept between pages for some time. Placed, not dropped. Positioned near the center of the desk's surface with a kind of deliberateness that made it very clear it had not blown in through the window. The window, in any case, was closed. Lyra stood very still and looked at the flower. She looked at the locked door. She looked at the window. She looked at the flower again. She picked it up carefully. It was dry and light, no scent left in it, the petals slightly translucent with age. A mountain flower, not something from a garden. She set it down again at the corner of her desk. She went back to work. She did not mention the flower to Corin. She mentioned it to no one. It was possible, she told herself, that the room had not been fully cleared after whoever last used it. Things got left behind in old rooms. A pressed flower in particular was the sort of thing that moved on a draft, settled somewhere, and looked intentional when it was not. This was a reasonable explanation. She was satisfied with it. She was not actually satisfied with it. The second day she saw him. She had known intellectually that she would. The stronghold was not so large that its occupants could remain entirely invisible to one another, and she had been told where her office was, near the king's study, adjacent technically. At some point, geometry alone would make an encounter inevitable. She was not prepared for it to happen in the corridor at exactly 8 in the morning when she was carrying 2 notebooks, a jar of ointment, and a cup of tea she had not yet had time to drink. He came around the corner from the direction of the study. He was not announced. There was no sound of approaching footsteps, or none that cut through the ambient noise of the stronghold early in the morning, which meant that when Lyra turned the corner from the other direction, they arrived at the same point in the corridor at exactly the same moment. She stopped, he stopped. He was taller than she had formed any mental image of, which was strange, because she had not consciously formed a mental image of him at all. He wore dark clothing with no ceremony to it, no formal decoration, the kind of plain practical clothes that a person wears when they have not yet decided whether the day deserves dressing for. His hair was dark. His jaw was in need of a shave by a day or perhaps 2. His eyes were a particular shade of gray that the morning light in the corridor did not improve or soften in any way. He looked at her. She looked at him. She said, because someone had to say something, and apparently it was going to be her, "Good morning." He said, "Was." Not a greeting, a confirmation. "Yes," she said. He looked at the jar of ointment in her arms, at the notebooks, at the tea which was getting cold. "East Wing," he said. "Yes," she said again, "first patients in an hour." He nodded once. He moved to the right side of the corridor. She moved to the left. They passed each other with a foot of space between them. She walked the length of the corridor without looking back. She was fairly certain he did not look back either. She was not entirely certain. The third day she heard him through the wall. Not his voice, not clearly, just the sound of him moving in the study, a chair pushed back, the quiet sound of a book being set on a desk, footsteps that were unhurried and completely without self-consciousness. He was in the study for most of the afternoon. He did not knock on the locked door. She did not knock on it either. He had left the door to the study corridor open by a crack. She noticed this because his door was on the corridor side, and she passed it twice during the afternoon on her way to and from the East Wing, and both times the door was open precisely 3 inches, not more, not less. The same 3 inches both times, as if someone had thought about the exact angle and decided on it. Through the 3-inch gap the first time she passed, she heard nothing. The second time she passed, she heard a single brief sound. A bird. Not singing, not the repetitive noise of a caged bird with nothing to do. One sound, low and considering, like something that had noticed her footsteps and was deciding what it thought about them. She did not stop walking. That evening she returned to her room after dinner and found on her desk the moon button. It was bone-white, carved in the shape of a crescent, small enough to fit in the center of her palm. Old, well-made, the kind of button that had been on something good once and had since come off. No note, no explanation, no disturbed window latch, no cracked door, no sign of entry from anywhere she could identify. She picked it up, she turned it over. The back was smooth with 2 neat holes for thread, and the carving on the front was precise enough that someone with real skill had made it, not a found object, something that had been kept. She sat down at her desk with the button in her hand, and the pressed yellow flower at the corner where she had put it, and she thought, in a very careful and deliberate way, about what it meant that she had now received 2 things she had not asked for and could not explain. The most reasonable explanation was the bird. Corin had said the bird went where he liked. Corin had specifically said to put him out the window if she found him in her room. She had not found him in her room, but that did not mean he had not been there. Parrots, she understood, were intelligent animals. They observed things, they picked things up. They moved objects between locations with a purposefulness that looked, to the uninformed observer, very much like intention. The flower could have been in the room already. The button could have come from anywhere in the stronghold. A bird carrying it from a corridor or a table or a window ledge would explain both the arrival and the absence of any other source. This was the reasonable explanation. She turned the button over in her fingers again. She thought about the exact placement of the flower, centered on the desk. She thought about the deliberate 3 inches of open door. She set the button beside the flower. She opened her notebook to a clean page. She wrote in her precise medical shorthand, items acquired, source unknown, button bone crescent carved, flower pressed mountain variety yellow, placement intentional. She underlined intentional. Then below it she wrote bird. Then below that she wrote probably. She closed the notebook. She was not convinced it was probably. That night she lay in bed and listened to the quiet of the north corridor and the mountain beyond the window and the very particular silence of the study on the other side of the locked door. At some point late, she heard the door to the study open and close on the corridor side. Footsteps, unhurried, moving away. Then nothing. Just the mountain and the cold and the crescent moon outside her window, which she noticed, looking exactly like the button on her desk. She told herself it was a coincidence. She was not actually sure she believed in coincidences anymore. In the morning there was nothing new on her desk. She dressed and gathered her notes and went to the east wing. The soldier's fracture was healing well. The kitchen worker's rash was responding to the new treatment. The elderly woman had been cleared to go home and was being helped into a cart when Lyra arrived, and she pressed Lyra's hand and called her a good girl, which Lyra found unexpectedly touching. She returned to her office at midday. She sat down at her desk. She looked at the flower and the button for a long, quiet moment. Then she heard it, through the locked door, not through the wall exactly but through the door, which meant the other side of that door was not empty. A bird. Not one sound this time, too. The first was that low considering noise again, the second was something else, shorter, deliberate. Almost like a word. Not a word she could identify, but shaped like one. She sat very still. The sound did not repeat. She reached out and touched the edge of the moon button with one finger, just touched it, left it where it was. She had a patient to attend to in 20 minutes. She gathered her notebook. She paused at the door that led to the corridor. She looked back at the locked door. She looked at it for a long moment. Then she went to her patient. She did not ask Corin about the button. She did not ask the head physician or the soldiers or the kitchen workers or the elderly woman who had called her a good girl. She kept her own counsel, which was something she was used to doing, and she added the moon button to the growing list of things she was storing under probably and moving on from. The list was getting longer. She noticed this. She told herself it did not matter. That evening she came back from the Great Hall after dinner and sat at her desk with a medical text. She was supposed to be reviewing for a case the following morning, and she read 4 pages without taking in a single word, and then she set the book face down and looked at the ceiling and said out loud to the empty room, "What are you doing?" She was talking to herself. She was fairly certain she was talking to herself. From the other side of the locked door there was a very quiet sound, not a response, not anything that could be called a response by any rational person, just the small shift of something repositioning itself on a perch. Lyra looked at the door. The door told her nothing. She picked up the medical text. She read 3 more pages without taking in a single word. Outside, the mountain dark settled fully over Caldenmere, and the torches burned down to embers in the north corridor, and somewhere on the other side of a locked door, a grey parrot sat in the king's study and watched the light go under the door frame and waited, in the patient way of things that have already decided what they want, for morning. The soldier's name was Owen, and he had opinions about everything. Lyra had noticed this on her first visit. By the 3rd visit she had confirmation. By the 5th she had simply accepted it as a feature of treating him, and adjusted her examination schedule to include an extra 10 minutes for his commentary on the weather, the food, the state of his arm, the state of everyone else's arms, the general question of whether mountain winters were improving or getting worse, and on one memorable morning a detailed analysis of why the Great Hall's second-best table had slightly uneven legs, and what this said about the carpenter who had made it. She did not mind. Talkative patients were good patients. They told you things without realizing they were telling you things. Owen, in particular, had told her 3 useful things about the stronghold simply by talking about other things. The first was that the North Corridor was considered an unusual posting by the guards who rotated through it. It was quieter than the other corridors, darker by design, and the guards who were assigned to it tended to be newer or smaller in some way that Owen struggled to articulate beyond saying that they were quieter themselves. The second thing was that the king's study was where Callum Drake spent most evenings, not the war chamber, which was for formal reviews and meetings, not the Great Hall, which was for everything public, the study, which was for whatever he did when no one was officially watching. The third thing, which Owen mentioned entirely in passing while she was checking the alignment of the healing bone, was that the king's grey parrot was the most intelligent animal in the entire stronghold, and possibly in the entire mountain range, and that the guards who had been in service long enough had stopped being surprised by anything the bird did. Like what? Lyra asked, which she immediately regretted because Owen's face lit up. "Oh," he said, "where to begin?" She let him begin. She finished checking his arm while he talked, and she cleaned her instruments and made her notes, and she learned that Bishop, that was the parrot's name, Bishop, not a name she had expected, had at various points unlocked a cabinet he should not have had access to, moved a stack of correspondence from one desk to another in a way that looked intentional enough that someone had assumed a person had done it, and once spent 3 days carrying small objects from one end of the North Corridor to the other, for reasons that no one had ever identified. "What kind of objects?" Lyra asked. Owen thought about it. "Small ones," he said, which was not helpful, "nothing valuable, bits of things." She nodded. She wrote bit of things in her notebook out of professional habit, and then looked at what she had written and put a line through it. "Does he always do that?" she asked. "Carry things?" "When he's interested in something," Owen said, "or someone." He held his arm experimentally. "Feeling much better, by the way, thank you." "Another week," she said, "no lifting." "You sound exactly like my mother." "Your mother sounds like a sensible person." She left him still talking, which she had learned was the only clean way to exit a conversation with Owen, and she went back through the east wing and into the main corridor and toward the north passage. She was thinking about the objects, the flower, the button. She had added now a small blue feather she had found that morning at the edge of her windowsill, which was technically outside the window, but only barely. Blue, not gray, not a color that matched Bishop from what she had gathered, but Bishop, she was learning, was not a simple bird. She turned the corner into the North Corridor and found that the door to the king's study was open again. Not 3 inches this time, further, closer to 6. She could see the edge of a bookshelf through the gap, packed with books that were not arranged by color or size but by something else, some logic she could not identify from the corridor at a glance. She did not slow her pace. She did not look directly at the gap. She had decided, very deliberately not looking at the gap when she heard his voice. Not directed at her, he was speaking to someone inside the study, low, even unhurried, the same voice she had heard in the corridor on the first day when he had said her name like a confirmation. 2 words this time, too quiet to catch the specific words, but clearly a response to something. She heard Bishop's voice answer. Not in words she could identify, but in the tone of something engaged in a genuine exchange. She had not known parrots could sound like that, conversational, considered, as if they were actually thinking between phrases. She had passed the door now, she did not stop. She sat at her desk and did not open her notebook and looked at the blue feather at the edge of the window. She left the feather where it was. That evening she went to dinner and sat at one of the long tables in the great hall, which she had been doing each evening in order to get a general sense of the stronghold's social landscape. This was something her training had emphasized. Know the community you're embedded in. Understand the social structures, not because you're going to become part of every conversation, but because when something is wrong, you need to be able to recognize what the normal looks like first. The normal, as best she could determine, looked like this: 3 distinct clusters at the long tables, with fluid movement between them. The guards clustered near the west wall by habit. The household staff clustered near the kitchen doors. The advisors and senior staff clustered near the center, which was the most contested position in terms of sight lines to the head table and also the best acoustics for private conversation if you kept your voice very low. The head table was at the far end of the hall. Callum Drake sat at the head table each evening. He had a particular position at the far right end rather than the center, which Lyra had registered as unusual on her first evening and had since decided was simply his preference. He did not sit in the center because the center was for displays, and he, apparently, was not interested in displays. He ate, he spoke to whoever was seated nearest him, which rotated by day. He did not make announcements or speeches. He left when he was done, and his departure was quiet enough that people who were not paying attention sometimes did not notice it. Lyra had been paying attention. She told herself she was paying attention for professional reasons. Her job was to understand the community. Understanding the community meant understanding all its members. This was the same reason she paid attention to Owen's commentary, and to Corin's precise footsteps, and to the way the kitchen staff moved differently on days when the supply cart was coming compared to days when it was not. This was the same reason. She applied this explanation carefully and thoroughly, and moved on. Tonight, she ate her meal and talked briefly to a woman named Agnes who worked in the records room and was full of sharp observations about the weather. And then she looked up to find that Callum was watching her from the head table. Not watching, looking. His gaze, when she caught it, did not flinch or redirect. He looked at her for a moment longer, the way a person looks when they are thinking about something else and have happened to focus in a particular direction while they think, and then he returned his attention to the advisor beside him. Lyra looked back at her plate. She was not sure what she had just seen. She ate the rest of her meal without looking up again. The next morning she arrived at the East Wing at first bell to find 3 new patients. 2 guards who had been in a training exercise that had gone slightly wrong, and a woman who worked in the household accounts who had managed to cut her hand on a document clasp of all things. Lyra sorted them quickly, referred the less urgent of the guards to the first-year apprentice for cleaning and bandaging, took the other guard and the accounts woman herself, and spent the morning in the competent middle of her work where she was most comfortable. At mid-morning, she was sent for by head physician Warwick regarding a supply inventory that needed checking. She spent an hour with Warwick going through the storage room, noting what was running low and what needed reordering, and it was during this hour that Warwick mentioned, without any context that made it clear why he was mentioning it, that the king had an unusual habit of checking in on the medical stores himself on the first day of each month. "Not through us," Warwick said. "Not as an inspection, he just looks. I've never seen him take anything or change anything, he just looks." "Why?" Lyra asked. Warwick considered this. "Never asked," he said. She thought about this on the walk back to the North Corridor. It was the kind of thing that could mean nothing, or could mean that someone had developed the habit of wanting to know what resources were available for treating injuries. which was either an administrative concern or a personal one, or something in between that she did not have enough information to classify. She was thinking about this when she turned the corner of the north corridor and nearly collided with Bishop. Not Bishop in a cage, not Bishop on a perch at a distance. Bishop directly in the center of the corridor floor, standing on the stone with the absolute confidence of something that has never in its life doubted its right to occupy any space it happened to want to occupy. He was a gray parrot, large as parrots went. His feathers were a precise gradation of grays from dark to light, with a tail that was a deep, unambiguous red. His eyes were pale, ringed in white, and they were currently fixed on Lyra with an alertness that she found, on reflection, more unsettling than a bird's eyes had any right to be. She stopped. He did not move. She said, "Hello." He tilted his head, first to the right, then back to center. He made a sound that was not the low conversational sound she had heard through the wall. This was different, shorter, pointed. She was a physician. She understood that reading intention into the behavior of animals was a failure of rational thinking. She had been taught this. She believed it. She looked at this bird and had very significant difficulty applying it. "Your Bishop," she said. He made the sound again. She took a step to the left to pass him. He turned, following her movement, not blocking her but tracking her with those pale, unsettling eyes. She passed him. She went 3 more steps down the corridor. She looked back. He was still watching her. "I've been told not to feed you from my plate," she said, "and not to teach you anything." He ruffled his feathers once and then smoothed them again. She went into her office and closed the door. She sat at her desk and opened her notebook and wrote Bishop Corridor mid-morning, eye contact maintained, no aggression, deliberate. She stared at the last word, she crossed it out, she wrote it back in. There was a soft sound from the direction of her window. She looked up. Bishop was on the outer ledge, looking in through the glass with that same settled, considering attention. He had something in his beak, small, she could not see it clearly through the glass. She stood up slowly. She crossed to the window, she unlatched it and pushed it open an inch. He dropped what he was carrying onto the inner ledge. It was a folded piece of parchment, small, blank on the visible side, folded with a precision that did not suggest an accident. She picked it up and unfolded it. Blank both sides, completely blank. The fold was sharp and deliberate and the parchment was slightly worn at one edge, as if it had been carried for a while, but it said nothing, conveyed nothing, contained no mark of any kind. She looked at Bishop. He looked at her. She looked at the parchment. She held it up to the window light. Nothing, no impression, no faint mark, no watermark or hidden image, just a carefully folded piece of blank parchment. "What is this?" she said. She was aware she was asking a bird, she asked anyway. Bishop said nothing. She put the parchment on her desk beside the moon button and the pressed flower. She sat down. She looked at the 3 items arranged in a loose row: flower, button, parchment, objects from nowhere, objects left without explanation. Objects that arrived in her space the way thoughts arrive in the middle of the night, insistent and carrying no credentials. She looked at the locked door. The locked door did not offer any information. She had been in the stronghold 8 days. She had exchanged perhaps 30 words with the Alpha King. She had been left a flower, a crescent moon carved from bone, a blue feather, and now a folded blank page. She had seen her name said aloud like a checked item on a list. She had seen a pair of gray eyes on her in the great hall for a moment that was not nothing. She added all of this up. She got, at the end of the adding, an answer she did not trust. She closed her notebook. She went back to the East Wing. Owen was there for his daily check, and he talked for 17 minutes about the quality of last night's dinner and what it said about the cook's current mood. And Lyra examined his arm and gave her assessment, and sent him off and attended to 2 more patients, and wrote her notes, and returned to her office in the late afternoon. The folded parchment was still on her desk. She picked it up, she folded it back into the same precise shape it had arrived in. She placed it at the corner of the desk. She did not throw it away. She told herself she was keeping it because it might mean something later. That was a practical reason. She was a practical person. Outside, Bishop called once from somewhere beyond the window. The sound was close and then it was gone, and the north corridor returned to its usual held-breath quiet. and Lyra sat in her small room between the empty shelf and the locked door, and looked at a row of objects she had not asked for and could not explain, and refused, quite deliberately and with some effort, to draw any conclusions at all. She was going to need a larger notebook. It rained that night, the mountain kind of rain that came sideways and did not apologize for it. Lyra lay awake listening to it hit the window and thought, for reasons she could not precisely identify, about the shape of a crescent moon. She had carried one, she realized, not the button, the real thing. In her coat pocket for 3 years, a small silver coin with a moon pressed into one face that her grandmother had given her when she left home for her training. The coin was still in her coat pocket. She had not looked at it in months. She reached for it now in the dark, found it, turned it over with her thumb. Same shape, same curve. She put the coin back. She stared at the ceiling. She thought about Warwick's inventory, about Owen's arm, about the way the guards in the North Corridor moved like people who were careful not to make noise because they had learned to be, not because they had been told to be. She thought about Corin's exact choice of words: do not teach him anything, not do not interact with him, not stay away from the bird, teach. As if the bird was already in some kind of ongoing curriculum that Lyra might accidentally disrupt. She thought about a blank piece of parchment folded into a perfect square. She fell asleep sometime after that, and she dreamed about nothing she could remember in the morning, and when she woke the rain had stopped and the mountain was clear and cold and white, and on the sill inside her window there was a small stone, pale gray, round, smooth as something that had been in a river for years. She looked at it for a long time. Then she added it to the row. Flower, button, feather, parchment, stone. She poured herself a cup of water from the pitcher on the shelf and sat down at her desk and looked at the row and said, out loud, to the room and its locked door and its watching window, all right. She was not sure what she meant by that. She was fairly sure it was not nothing. She went to breakfast, she ate, she came back. On her desk there was a second smooth stone, placed precisely beside the first. She sat down and looked at it, and then she laughed, just once, short, surprised out of her. She pressed her hand over her mouth, the laugh settled, she shook her head. You have an agenda, she said to the room. The room did not confirm or deny this. She went to work. She started keeping a log of Bishop's deliveries. This was not, she told herself, because she was treating the situation as significant. It was because she was a physician and physicians documented anomalies, and a gray parrot with a consistent delivery schedule was, by any reasonable definition, an anomaly. Documentation was professional. Documentation was neutral. Documentation did not mean anything about what she thought the deliveries meant. She wrote the log in the back of her notebook, after the patient notes, in small handwriting she had developed for exactly this kind of marginal information. Things she was tracking without yet knowing why. Day 1, pressed yellow flower, mountain variety, estimated age 2 to 3 weeks. Placement, center of desk, source, unknown. Day 3, moon, button, bone, crescent carved, 2 holes, excellent condition. Placement, desk surface, left of center. Source, window ledge, entry likely, confirmed, not previously in room. Day 5, blue feather, species consistent with mountain jay, left at window edge. Significance unclear, Bishop's own feathers are gray and red. Day 6, folded parchment, blank on both sides, fold precise, paper worn at corner, left by Bishop directly witnessed. Day 8, smooth river stone, pale gray, brought overnight. Day 9, second smooth river stone, pair, morning, breakfast hour. She read this list back to herself. Flower, button, feather, blank page, 2 stones. If she was cataloging the symptoms of a patient, she would say that there was a pattern here. The items were not random. They had a consistency, all small, all carried without damage, all placed with deliberate positioning rather than dropped, all appearing either overnight or during the specific windows when she was in the East Wing. Which meant either Bishop had developed his own independent interest in her room, or someone was aware of her schedule. She wrote, pattern suggests coordination with access schedule, further observation required. She closed the notebook. She looked at the locked door. She had thought about knocking on it 7 times in the past 9 days. She had not knocked. Each time she had thought about it, she had constructed a reason not to. Too early in the morning, too late in the evening, not enough of a reason, not the right kind of reason. Not any reason she could articulate cleanly without making the act of knocking sound like something it might be and therefore could not be, and therefore she was not going to think about. She was thinking about it now. She put her notebook in her bag and went to the east wing. Owen was there. He was also, she discovered, in conversation with a man named Gareth, who was another long-service guard and who had apparently come to visit Owen during his appointment, which was not strictly allowed, but which Lyra decided to be flexible about because Gareth was sitting in the corner and not interfering, and Owen's mood was notably better with company. Gareth had opinions that were different from Owen's. Where Owen's opinions were broad and social, Gareth's were specific and dry. He commented on 3 things during the half-hour she was there: the quality of the light in the east wing, the fact that the second-floor balcony on the south side had a loose rail that had been reported twice without being fixed, and Bishop. He mentioned Bishop because Owen mentioned Bishop first. Owen had been telling her about Bishop's history since day 2, offering installments like episodes in a story he had been telling for years. Today's installment was about the time Bishop had appeared in the Great Hall during a formal dinner and sat at the end of the high table without anyone being able to explain how he had gotten there or why he stayed for 2 full courses before departing. Wouldn't go back to the study all evening after that, Owen said. Sat on the window in the corridor instead, right outside the doctor's old office. Lyra looked up from her notes. Old office. Before your room was a room, it was the previous physician's office. Before him, it was some kind of planning room. North Corridor's been a lot of things. She wrote this down, not in the medical notes. In the margin. Gareth from the corner said, "Bird picks people." She looked at him. He did not look up from the corner. He had his arms folded and his eyes slightly distant, the way men look when they say something they consider obvious and are not particularly interested in whether other people agree. "What does that mean?" she asked. "Means what it sounds like," Gareth said. "Bird picks people. Somebody catches his attention and he pays attention, follows them, brings things." He paused. "Mostly he doesn't bother." "Who has he bothered before?" Gareth considered. 2 or 3 in the years I've been here." "And what happened with them?" He looked at her then, a brief flat look. "Stayed," he said. He did not elaborate. She finished with Owen and went back to the North Corridor and stood outside her door for a moment before going in. The study door was closed. She could hear nothing from it. She went into her room and stood at her desk and looked at the items in their row, and then she picked up the moon button. She had done this several times, picked it up, turned it over, set it back. The bone was warm from the room by now. The crescent curve fit against the pad of her thumb in a way that felt specific, not accidental, made for this curve, made to be held. She set it back. She picked up the blank parchment. She had unfolded it and refolded it twice, looking for something she had missed. There was nothing to miss, it was blank. And yet it had been carried here with the same intention as everything else, placed with the same careful placement, and she could not decide if the blankness was the message, or if the blankness was simply a mistake, something picked up that was not meant to carry any content. A blank page given to someone who reads. What does a blank page say? She put it down. She was going to stop thinking about this and do her paperwork. She did her paperwork. At midday she heard voices in the study, more than one voice, which was unusual. She heard Callum's voice, low and without expression, and at least one other, higher and slightly quick, the voice of someone making an argument. She could not hear the words, she did not try to. She heard the argument end. She heard one set of footsteps leave through the corridor door. She heard silence, and then she heard Bishop and Callum's voice again, short, and then silence again. She sat very still for a moment, not working, not moving, just occupying the small office in the holding its breath quiet. Then she heard the study door open to the corridor. Footsteps stopping outside her door. She did not breathe. A knock, precise, 2 knocks. She breathed, she stood, she went to the door and opened it. Callum was standing in the corridor. He was in the plain dark clothing again. He had a slight tension across his shoulders that had not been there in their previous encounters, the held-back evidence of a difficult conversation she was not supposed to know he'd had. He looked at her. He said, "Do you have willow bark preparation in your supplies?" She said, "Yes." He said, "Headache." She blinked, then she turned and went to her medical kit. which she kept in a specific order that meant she could find anything in it in the dark, and she found the willow bark preparation and measured a correct dose into a small paper and folded it and came back to the door. He was still there, he had not moved. She held out the paper, he took it. His fingers did not touch hers in the exchange, the deliberate way of a person being precise about contact. "Take it with water," she said. "Let it sit if you can, an hour." He nodded. He looked at her for one moment longer than the exchange required. Then he said, "Thank you, Voss." And he went back into the study and closed the door. She stood in her doorway and looked at the closed door. After a moment she went back to her desk and sat down. Bishop arrived at her window ledge 2 hours later. He was carrying something small, and she was already standing up to see what it was before she had consciously decided to stand. He dropped it on the sill. It was a small piece of willow bark, dry, stripped clean, not medicinal, not prepared, just a piece of bark, pale and curved. She picked it up. She set it at the end of her row. Flower, button, feather, parchment, 2 stones, bark. She sat back down. She picked up her pen. She wrote in the back of the notebook, "The items are connected to him." This is no longer a reasonable question. It is a confirmed observation. Bishop is not random. The bird picks people and Bishop has picked me and the items are connected to him. She stopped writing. She looked at what she had written. She wrote beneath it in smaller letters, "What I do not know is whether he knows." She put the pen down. She looked at the locked door. She had heard him say thank you. She had heard the care in the way he said her name, not as a greeting, not as a social form, but as a thing he chose to say carefully because saying it carelessly was not an option he was willing to take. She had been in the stronghold just over 2 weeks. She had received 7 objects. She had had 3 conversations with Callum Drake, if you counted the corridor and the dining hall look, and just now in the doorway. She had no conclusions that she could defend with any evidence. But she sat at her desk, and she looked at the willow bark that matched the treatment she had just given for his headache, and she understood something dimly at the edges of things that she was not ready to look at directly yet. She put the willow bark with the others. She went to dinner. He was at the head table. He looked from where she sat like someone whose headache had improved. She noted this as a professional observation and returned to her soup. She noticed, in her peripheral vision, that he did not look at her once during the entire meal. She noticed that she noticed this. She ate her bread and salt and looked at the wall. On her way back through the north corridor, she passed the maid named Dora who did the linens for the north rooms. Dora was young and warm and easy to talk to, and she had been asking Lyra casual questions all fortnight in the way of someone who was genuinely curious rather than socially obligated. Tonight Dora said, "Has the bird been bothering you?" Lyra said, "I wouldn't call it bothering." Dora looked at her with a particular expression and said nothing. "What?" Lyra said. "Nothing," Dora said. Then after a pause, in the voice of someone sharing a thought they have been holding for a while, "He hasn't brought things to anyone's room in nearly 4 years. Bishop. We all noticed when it started again." Lyra said, "Who notices?" Dora said, "Everyone who's been here long enough." She picked up her linen basket. She added very quietly, "He learned that from someone, or he does it for someone, we were never entirely sure which." She gave Lyra a small, careful smile. "Good night." She was gone before Lyra could ask her anything else. Lyra stood in the corridor and looked at the space Dora had occupied. Then she went into her room. She looked at the row on her desk. She picked up the blank parchment. She unfolded it one more time. She wrote very lightly in the bottom right corner a single word, "Why?" She folded it back along the exact original creases. She put it at the end of the row, in the most visible position, where it could be seen from the window. She went to bed. She told herself she did not know what she expected. In the morning, the parchment was gone. In its place there was a feather from Bishop himself, one single gray feather, pale and precise, standing upright in a small crack in the desk surface where it had been slipped to hold it steady. No flower this time, no stone, just the gray feather placed with intention from the bird himself. She picked it up. She held it. Outside, Bishop called once from the corridor, a short sound, close, and then his talons were briefly audible on the corridor stones, moving away toward the study. Lyra sat with the gray feather in her hand. She said very quietly, "All right." She meant it differently than the last time she had said it. She was not entirely sure what she meant by it, but it was different. She put the feather in the center of the desk, where the flower had first appeared. She went to work. 2 days later, Gareth came into the East Wing not for Owen's sake, but for his own. He had a strained tendon in his right hand from a training drill, and he sat on the examination table with his usual flat composure while Lyra assessed it. "You'll need to rest it," she said. "Strapping for a week, no full grip." He nodded. She began strapping the hand. She said carefully and without looking up, "You said Bishop brings things to people, 2 or 3 in the years you've been here." Gareth watched the wall. "Who were they?" she asked. "Cook's old assistant," he said, "stayed 12 years. Left when she married and moved south." He paused. "And the planning advisor, before him, someone whose name I don't remember, a builder who came for the South Tower repairs. And they all stayed." 3 out of 3, Gareth said, "until they didn't." She finished the strapping. She looked up at him. "Is there something you're trying to tell me?" He looked at her with the same flat, obvious look from before. He said, "The bird has good instincts." He stood and tested the strapping with a gentle flex. "So does the king. Those are 2 separate observations." He left. She sat on the stool with the strapping cloth in her hands. 2 separate observations. 3 out of 3. She put the cloth away and washed her hands and went back to the north corridor and into her room, and sat at her desk with the gray feather in the center, and the whole arrangement of delivered objects around it like evidence at a review. And she thought, for the first time, plainly and directly, about what it meant to be the fourth. She did not reach a conclusion. Conclusions, she had learned, came after all the evidence was in, and she was quite certain she did not yet have all the evidence. But she thought about it. And she looked at the gray feather. And she did not throw anything away. On the 4th week of her posting, the 3rd snowfall of the season came down off the high peaks and settled over Caldenmere with the settled weight of something planning to stay. The stronghold changed in snow. The corridors grew quieter because the outer doors were kept closed against the cold, and the great hall was fuller in the evenings because there was nowhere else to go, and the light through every window turned a flat, particular white that had no edge to it. Lyra liked it. She had not expected to like it. She had grown up in a valley town, green and mild, and mountain winters were new to her, and the first 2 snowfalls had made her feel slightly enclosed, slightly far from anything she knew. The 3rd snowfall was different. The 3rd snowfall felt like the mountains settling around the stronghold the way a blanket settles, and she sat at her window in the morning and watched it fall in the white light and felt, without naming it, something she had not felt in a long time. Not at home. That was too simple a word, and she was not sure it was the right one. Just settled, just here. She looked at her desk, at the gray feather and the stones and the button and the bark and all the rest. She was the 4th person Bishop had decided to pay attention to. And the stronghold was settling around her in the white morning. She made a decision, small and without ceremony. She was not going to move in 3 weeks when the quarters wing was finished. She was going to ask Corin if the North Office could be a permanent arrangement. She made herself a cup of tea and did not knock on the locked door and went to work. But the decision sat in her chest like a smooth river stone, round and worn and exactly the right weight, and she thought she had not felt anything that settled in a very long time. She went to see Corin the following morning. Corin listened to her request with the expression of someone who had been expecting it and had already decided on the answer. She said she would look into the arrangements. She did not say yes. She did not say no. She said she would look into it. That evening, Lyra came back to her room to find that her shelf was no longer empty. Someone had put a small potted plant on it. Mountain rosemary, green and sharp-smelling and very much alive. A clay pot, good soil, placed carefully so the morning light from the window would reach it. She stood in the doorway of her room and looked at the plant on the shelf. She looked at the locked door. She looked at the plant. She walked to the shelf and touched one of the small stiff leaves, and it released its smell into the cold room, clean and particular. She said nothing, There was no one to say anything to. She added the plant to her list. She underlined settled. She went to bed. She began keeping her log in a separate notebook. The first notebook was for patience. That was its purpose, and she intended to preserve it for that purpose alone, which meant that the increasingly detailed entries she had been making in the back pages about delivered objects and corridor observations, and significant pauses and gray feathers had to be moved. She bought the second notebook from the records room, where Agnes sold supplies from a drawer under her desk with the efficiency of someone who had made this small side arrangement years ago and saw no reason to change it. The new notebook was smaller, with a dark blue cover. She labeled the spine with a medical term that meant something to her and nothing to anyone else who might glance at it. She transferred her notes. Flower, button, feather, parchment, 2 stones, bark, gray feather, rosemary plant. She added below the list the new items from the past week, a piece of blue sea glass which made no geographic sense in a mountain stronghold and which she therefore found more interesting than all the other items combined. A very small folded note that had 3 words on it in handwriting that was not hers, which she was going to address shortly, and a second gray feather that had arrived the same morning as the note, stuck upright in the clay pot of the rosemary plant. She read the note again. 3 words, the handwriting was small and precise, the letters closely formed, the ink a dark blue that matched the color of the glass piece that had arrived the same day. The 3 words were, "Have you slept?" She had stared at these words for 20 minutes the morning they arrived. She had turned the paper over, nothing. She had looked at the handwriting for a long time, trying to connect it to something she had seen in the stronghold, any document or label or notice. She had not seen this handwriting before. She had written beneath the 3 words in her own hand, adequately, "Why?" She had folded the note and placed it at her window ledge and gone to the east wing. When she returned, the note was gone. Bishop was on the ledge. He looked at her with his pale, specific eyes. "Did you take it?" she asked. He ruffled his feathers. "Was it for someone?" He made the low sound. She went inside and found on her desk the blue glass. She held it up to the window. The light came through it in a particular shade, not quite blue and not quite green, the color of something that had been in the sea long enough to forget its original shape and become something new. Sea glass in a mountain stronghold. She put it in the notebook beside the 3 words. She was building a case, and she was not sure yet what the case was for. That evening at dinner, she sat in her usual place and ate her usual meal and watched the room in her usual professional way, and Owen stopped by to report without being asked that his arm felt excellent, and Agnes passed through and mentioned that the records room was getting a new catalog system, and Corin appeared briefly at the kitchen door and looked at the room with administrative precision before disappearing again. Callum was at the head table. He spoke tonight to the woman on his right, who was one of the senior advisors, a steady woman named Prudence who had been at Caldenmere for many years and whose opinion, Lyra had gathered, carried significant weight. Their conversation was quiet and apparently efficient. Callum's posture during it was the same as always, straight, still, not relaxed but not tense in the way of someone trying, steady in the way of something that simply was. He did not look at Lyra's table. She ate her bread. She had been watching him not look at her table for enough evenings now to have observed a pattern. He looked at every other part of the room during dinner, the west wall where the guards clustered, the kitchen doors, the advisors at the center tables, the space between tables where people moved. He did not look at her table. She had, over the course of the past week, worked out what this meant. When people avoided looking at something, it was generally not because the thing was uninteresting. She added this to her notebook when she got back, not as a detail about an object but as an observation. Under the heading she had written the medical term for the phenomenon of attending carefully to the periphery while appearing to observe the center. She wrote, "Consistent, 7 evenings, no variation." Below that she wrote, "The sea glass is from somewhere else, he has been somewhere else, someone who travels keeps sea glass." Below that she wrote, "Have you slept?" is a question that requires knowing someone is not sleeping, which requires attention to the kind of detail you cannot observe from across a room. She looked at what she had written. She closed the notebook. She picked up the blue glass and held it. The next morning she found on the windowsill a small dry twig of heather, purple-gray and wintersparse. She added it to the list. She also found that she was smiling slightly when she added it, which she acknowledged and then addressed as follows. She put the pen down, placed both hands flat on the desk, breathed once, picked the pen back up, and wrote the heather down in the same precise shorthand as everything else. She was a physician. Physicians documented things. She was absolutely documenting this. She went to the East Wing with her patient notebook and the blue cover notebook in her bag, which she had not done before, and she saw her patients and wrote her notes and checked Owen's arm one last time before officially releasing him from treatment, which he received with such warm gratitude that she had to turn away to hide that she was smiling again. She was apparently doing a lot of smiling. This was new. On her way back through the North Corridor, she passed a man she had not encountered before. He was perhaps 50, well-dressed in the way of someone who traveled for work rather than ceremony, and he was walking briskly in the direction of the war chamber with the purposeful stride of someone who knew where he was going and was behind schedule for getting there. He passed her with a brief nod. She turned to continue and found that Bishop was sitting on the corridor floor behind her, in the same location where she had first encountered him, watching the man's retreating back. "Friend of yours?" she asked. Bishop looked at her. She crouched down, which put her at eye level with the bird, which was a strange thing to do, but felt like the right thing to do given the specific seriousness of his expression. "He's from outside," she said. "The man, he came in the past day or two. I haven't seen him before." Bishop said nothing. "What's he here for?" "Nothing. You don't know or you won't say." He ruffled his feathers once. Then he turned and walked down the corridor toward the study with the measured pace of something that had finished the conversation and was now moving on. She straightened up. She went into her room and sat at her desk and opened the blue notebook. She wrote visitor, unknown purpose. Bishop tracked him in the corridor, possible concern. She underlined possible. That afternoon the tone of the stronghold changed. She felt it before she identified it. A shift in the way sound moved through the halls. Voices that had been at their usual pitch dropped slightly. Guards who had been posted in pairs were joined by thirds. Corin crossed the North Corridor twice in an hour, which was unusual, and each time her face was entirely closed. Lyra came out of her room at one point and found 2 guards standing outside the study door who had not been there before. They looked at her with the blank, professional courtesy of people doing their jobs and not explaining themselves. She went back inside. She opened her notebook. She wrote, shift in security, 2 additional guards study entrance, visitor or information from outside, no communication to medical staff. She thought about the 3 words in the man's handwriting, have you slept? She thought about the blank parchment she had written why, on. She thought about the gray feather standing in the rosemary pot. She had been building a case without knowing what she was building toward. She was beginning to suspect that the case was not just about objects. The evening meal was more subdued than usual. The guards at the west wall were quieter. The advisors at the center tables were careful with their expressions in the way that meant something had happened that they were not ready to discuss. Owen was there, and he uniquely was also quieter than usual, which told her more than anything else that the shift was significant, because Owen's silence was a genuine weather indicator. Callum was at the head table. He looked tonight like someone who had spent the afternoon in a room that required something from him that he had given fully and at some cost, not showing it in any way that the room at large could identify. But Lyra was trained to read the body in very specific ways, and she read the slight set of his shoulders and the controlled quality of his stillness, and she knew. He looked at her table. Not a long look, a brief one. The same way someone glances in a direction and then corrects, like checking a compass and then returning to their path. But he looked. She looked back. He did not change expression. She did not change expression. He looked away. She looked away. She ate the rest of her dinner with her eyes on her plate and her hands steady, and her mind doing a thing she had learned not to let it do, which was arrive at conclusions it was not yet entitled to reach. She went back to the North Corridor. She went into her room. She sat at her desk. She picked up the blue glass and turned it in her fingers. She thought about adequate, have you slept? Why, the blank parchment gone and the gray feather in its place, 3 out of 3, stay, good instincts, 2 separate observations. She thought about the pressed flower, placed in the center of a desk in a room before she arrived, which was either a coincidence or it was not. She thought about a pair of gray eyes on her in the great hall, brief and settled, and immediately corrected. She opened her blue notebook. She wrote at the top of a fresh page, "What I know." She wrote under it everything she knew. It took 2 pages. She read it back. She closed the notebook. She said to the locked door, "I'm not ready to know this yet." The locked door said nothing. Bishop, somewhere beyond the window in the dark corridor, called once. She pressed her hand over the blue notebook. She was not ready, but she was also not going to throw away a single feather or stone or piece of glass, and she knew quietly and completely what that meant. She went to bed. In the morning the stronghold was calmer. Whatever had shifted had settled. The extra guards at the study door were gone. The corridor sounded like itself again. On her desk was a small piece of map, torn with care along the edges. She picked it up. It showed in detailed old ink the mountain pass nearest to the valley town where she had grown up. She sat down. She looked at it for a long time. She was not ready. She held the map piece anyway. She spent the morning with it on the corner of her desk, in her peripheral vision while she worked through her patient files and updated her supply requests and wrote 3 letters that needed writing. Every time she caught sight of the torn edge of the map, she stopped moving for a moment, just for a moment. Then she went back to work. At midday she picked it up and held it to the window light the way she had held the parchment. The ink was old. The map was older than the stronghold, she thought, or close to it. Someone had kept it carefully, not folded carelessly, stored flat or in a book, the ink still sharp, the edges not foxed. The particular section shown was small. The pass, a river, 3 ridgelines, the beginning of the valley below. The place names were in a script she knew from the records she had studied before her training moved her to the city. The valley names. The old names, the ones that the newer maps had replaced with simpler versions. Someone who had this map knew the old names. She set it down. She wrote in her blue notebook, "Map fragment, old cartography, pre-revision names, mountain pass shows the approach to my origin valley, item 10. She added 10 items in 5 weeks. She looked at the number. 10. She thought about the cook's assistant who had stayed 12 years, the planning advisor, the builder who had done the South Tower. She thought about 4. She was the 4th. Bishop had never gone past 5 items with the others, or so she had gathered from Gareth and Dora and Owen's commentary, building the picture through collected details over weeks. A few things, enough to signal attention, and then the person had stayed or not stayed and the pattern had either deepened or stopped. 10 was not a few things. 10 was a sustained argument. She looked at the map. She put it in the blue notebook, between 2 pages flat, the way it had been stored before. She decided, going to stop asking what the items meant and start asking what she was going to do about it. This was a harder question. She sat with it through the afternoon and into the evening and all the way through dinner, where she ate without tasting her food and spoke to no one and returned to the north corridor before most people had finished their meals. She went to her room. She stood at the desk. She opened the blue notebook to the page that said "What I know." She read it twice. She closed it. She looked at the locked door. She stood there for a full minute. Then she picked up the moon button, which was the oldest of the items and the one she always came back to, and she held it in her closed hand. She said aloud to the room, 2 more weeks. I'll know what I mean by 2 more weeks. She put the button down. She was giving herself a deadline. Physicians did this with difficult decisions. 2 more weeks, gather the remaining data, then decide. This was reasonable. She was being reasonable. She went to bed with the blue notebook under her pillow and the map fragment safe inside it, and she looked at the ceiling and the cold mountain dark pressed against her window, and she thought that the valley in the map was 7 days' ride south, and she had not been back in 2 years, and she did not, right at this moment, miss it at all. She thought about what that meant. She thought about it until she fell asleep. In the morning she asked Corin about making the North Office permanent. Corin said, with the expression of someone who had already looked into it and found the answer unsurprising, "Yes. That can be arranged." Lyra said, "Thank you." Corin said, and then as she turned to go, she said, "The plant, on your shelf, you should know it requires particular attention in winter. The air here gets too dry. It needs a bowl of water nearby kept full to keep the humidity." She left before Lyra could ask how Corin knew about the plant. Lyra went back to her room and looked at the rosemary. She found a small bowl in the kitchen and filled it with water and put it beside the pot. She added the bowl to her list as item 11. She drew a line under 11. She went to work. Owen found her in the corridor that afternoon to share the news that his arm was completely fine, and to also share, apparently as a related matter, that the visitor from 2 days ago had been a border envoy with a complicated message about the South Territories, and that there had been 2 very long strategy meetings, and that Callum had not slept for most of the second day, or so Gareth's estimate suggested. "How does Gareth estimate that?" Lyra asked. "Lights in the study," Owen said. "The guards track them, been tracking for years, it's not official." He paused. "He doesn't sleep well when things are bad at the borders." She thought about 3 words in precise handwriting. "Have you slept?" She said, "That's useful to know medically." Owen looked at her. She added, "In case I'm ever called on to treat him." "Right," Owen said, in the tone of a man who believed about half of what he was hearing. He was cheerful about it. He tipped his head in farewell and walked off whistling something she half recognized from the south. She stood in the corridor. She looked down at her hands. The blue glass was in her coat pocket, which it had been for 3 days now, which was information she was not yet cataloging. She was running out of ways to be neutral about this. She had 2 more weeks to figure out what she was going to do. She went back to her room and picked up the map fragment and just held it for a while, not reading it, just feeling the age of the paper and the care with which it had been kept, and the fact that it showed her the path home. She decided she didn't need 2 more weeks. She put the map down and picked up the blank page from the beginning of her collection, the one on which she had written why, and which had been returned to her as a gray feather. She turned it over. She wrote on the blank parchment in her cleanest and most deliberate hand, "I've been counting." She put it at the window ledge. She went to bed. She did not check in the morning if it was gone. She went straight to the east wing. But she was smiling when she walked through the stronghold in the early morning light, and she was not particularly interested in stopping. The treaty broke on a Tuesday. Lyra knew it was Tuesday because she had been updating her weekly supply records, which she did on Tuesdays without fail, and she was in the middle of writing the date when she heard the war chamber doors open with the particular weight of something that had been shut too hard. Not slammed, controlled, which was worse. Voices, more than one, moving fast toward the great hall. She stayed at her desk and listened to the sounds of the stronghold reorganizing itself around something that had gone wrong, and she thought about what Owen had told her about the border envoy and the South Territories, and she put down her pen. She waited. The reorganizing sounds lasted about an hour. Then the stronghold went quiet in the specific way. It went quiet when people were doing things they needed to concentrate on, and noise was a cost. She went back to her supply records. She was a physician. Her job was patience. Her job was not treaties or border agreements or whatever had come apart in the war chamber on a Tuesday morning. Her job was to be prepared for what came after those things, which was her particular relationship with the stronghold's difficulties. She finished the supply records. She went to the east wing and saw the afternoon's patients. A young woman who worked in the granary with a repetitive strain in her wrist, a guard with a wisdom tooth that was causing trouble in ways that exceeded her expertise, and whom she referred to the dental practitioner in the village, and an older man from the household accounts whose spectacles had broken and who had been squinting for a week in a way that had caused a significant headache. She fixed what she could, referred what she couldn't, wrote her notes, and returned to the north corridor as the evening light turned the stone walls from gray to amber. The study door was closed. She heard nothing from it. She went into her room and stood at her desk and looked at the rosemary plant on the shelf, which was doing well. The bowl of water beside it was doing its job. She had refilled it 3 times since Corin told her about it. She changed her coat and washed her face and went to the great hall for dinner. The great hall was different tonight. Not in any way that could be pointed at directly. The same number of people, the same arrangement of tables, the same smells from the kitchen and the same low sound of multiple conversations, but the weight was different. Everyone was carrying something tonight that they were being careful about. She sat and ate and listened with her professional ears and gathered, from the tone and the silences and the direction people did not look, that the treaty difficulty was serious. Owen was not there. He had been cleared from her care, but she had started to track his presence in the hall as a general social indicator, and his absence tonight was noted. Gareth was there. He sat with 3 other guards and ate with his usual flat efficiency and said nothing to anyone. He looked once at the head table. Callum was there. He was in his usual position at the far right end of the head table, and he was alone. The advisor seats beside him were empty, which she had not seen before. He had a meal in front of him that he was not eating. He had a cup of something beside the meal that he was also not drinking. He sat with his hands on the table, and he looked at the middle distance. 2 advisors had been dismissed. She had heard this later from a different source. 2 advisors, their decisions in the treaty process called into question by the collapse. She did not know the details. She knew the shape of it, a decision made, a result gone wrong, responsibility placed. She ate her bread. She looked at the untouched meal at the head table. She looked at it for a long time. She was a physician. She got up. She went to the kitchen and she asked the cook, a broad, competent woman named Marjorie who had been at Caldenmere for 30 years, and who looked at her with the expression of someone who had seen everything twice, for a plate of bread and salt. Plain, Lyra said. Marjorie looked at her, for the north corridor. Lyra said yes. Marjorie said nothing. She put together a plate. She added a small portion of something warm without being asked, and then looked at Lyra as if daring her to argue. She did not argue. She took the plate through the great hall, and she walked the length of it, and she pushed open the door at the far end, and went into the passage behind the head table, and she knocked once on the door that led directly into the hall's anteroom, which was where she had calculated Callum had to go to leave without crossing the main floor. She was wrong about where he was still in the hall. She came back through the kitchen side door and simply walked to the head table. She set the plate down beside his untouched meal. She did not look at him. She sat down in one of the empty advisor chairs, which was absolutely not her place to sit in and which she was doing anyway. She was aware, without looking at him, that he had gone very still. She said nothing. He said nothing. She picked up her own cup of water and drank from it and set it down again. The great hall continued around them at its careful, weighted distance. She counted without meaning to, because she counted things now as a matter of habit. She counted 11 seconds of silence before he reached forward and took a piece of bread from the plate. She still did not look at him. He ate the bread. He ate it slowly, the way someone eats when they are doing it deliberately, as a practice, not because they are hungry but because they have decided to eat and they are going to do that thing. She looked at the far end of the hall. She saw Gareth look once at the head table and then look away with the particular expression of someone who has seen something that confirms a long-held theory. She sat for 11 minutes. She counted those 2, not deliberately. It happened. 11 minutes in which she drank her water and he ate the bread and a portion of the warm thing Marjorie had added, and neither of them said anything, and the hall moved around them at its careful distance. Then she picked up the empty plate and stood. She said, "Try to sleep tonight." He looked up at her, just at her. She was looking at him now. She had been not looking at him for 11 minutes, and now she was looking, and the gray of his eyes in the low evening light of the great hall was the color of the mountain before a storm, and his face was the face of a man who had spent the day in the middle of something very costly and was not close to finished with it. She held the look for 2 seconds. 3. She said, "It helps with the problem solving." She walked back through the hall with the empty plate. She returned it to Marjorie, who took it without a word. She went through the kitchen door and into the corridor and down through the north passage and into her room, and she sat at her desk. She was shaking slightly. She was not going to document that. She breathed in, she breathed out. She picked up the moon button, she held it. He had eaten the bread. That was all, that was the whole of it. He had been sitting with an untouched meal in front of him, and she had brought bread and sat beside him, and he had eaten it, and then she had told him to sleep, and he had looked at her. But the look. She had been cataloging his looks for weeks now, across the hall, in the corridor. The brief, settled look in the great hall 11 minutes ago, and the correction after. This one had been different. This one had been direct, no distance to it, no corridor between them, just him looking at her and her looking back, and the gray of his eyes carrying something she did not have words for yet, and was going to have to develop words for because she was running out of ways to document it as something else. She put the moon button down. She opened the blue notebook. She wrote at the top of a new page, "Tonight." She could not write more than that. She tried, she picked up the pen 3 times and put it down. The words she had access to were either too small or too large. The medical vocabulary she used for precision did not have a category for this. The ordinary vocabulary she used for ordinary things was not right either. She wrote, "Finally, he looked at me like I was someone he had been waiting for." She looked at that. She did not cross it out. She closed the notebook. She lay on her bed without sleeping and looked at the ceiling and listened to the mountain dark and the occasional sound from the corridor. No sounds from the study, nothing through the locked door. Sometime past the deep middle of the night she heard footsteps, coming from the study, crossing the corridor, going not away from her room but toward the north window at the end of the passage. Stopping. A long pause. Then returning. She heard the study door, she heard nothing more. She looked at the ceiling. She was a physician. She knew what interrupted sleep and midnight pacing looked like in a patient's history. She knew what sustained it and what resolved it. She thought about bread and salt and 11 minutes, and not saying anything and the man who had eaten it slowly. She thought, this is not going to be simple. She thought, I did not come here for simple. In the morning she went to the East Wing and she was professional and precise and she treated her patients well. And she came back at midday and found a small piece of sea glass on her desk, blue-green, different from the first piece, slightly larger with a frosted edge on one side where the sea had worked it longer. She picked it up. She held it in the light. She could feel faintly, through all the professional vocabulary and the careful documentation and the deliberate not concluding, something becoming clear. The way things become clear in winter when the clouds part and the mountain shows itself fully, all at once without warning. She had 11 minutes of bread and salt and silence and one look. She had enough. She put the sea glass in her coat pocket next to the blue piece. 2 stones in her pocket, smooth and particular. She went back to work. She passed Gareth in the outer corridor that afternoon. He did not say anything. He looked at her coat pocket where the glass pressed a slight shape against the fabric, and then he looked at her face and then he looked away again. She said, "What?" He said, "Nothing." She said, "You keep looking at me like I've done something." He said, "You brought bread to the head table." He said it the way a man states a fact that is also the resolution of an argument he's been having quietly with himself for a long time. "I've been at Caldenmere for 19 years. In 19 years, he has sat alone at that table with an untouched meal in front of him approximately a dozen times. Never once has anyone brought him bread." She looked at Gareth. He looked back at her with his flat, certain eyes. He said, "The bird has good instincts." He walked on. She stood in the corridor for a moment. Then she went to her room and sat at her desk and picked up the new blue-green glass piece and turned it over and said to the room, "I know." She was talking to herself. She was fairly certain, talking to the locked door. Neither confirmed or denied anything. She added the blue-green glass to her notebook. Item 13. She looked at the number. She thought about the cook's assistant who had stayed 12 years. She had passed 12. She was on 13. She looked at the locked door. She was on 13 items and she had brought a man bread and salt and sat with him in silence for 11 minutes, and he had eaten every piece and looked at her like she was someone he had been waiting to find. And she was a physician who documented anomalies, and she had run completely out of neutral language for any of this. She picked up her pen. She wrote, "I think I am going to stay." She looked at it. She added, "Not because of the items, not because of the bird, not because 3 out of 3 before me stayed." She added, "Because of 11 minutes and bread and salt, and a man who does not explain himself, and has been leaving me things through a bird for 6 weeks, because he does not know how else to begin." She added at the bottom, "And because the mountain is beautiful in the snow and the rosemary on my shelf is growing and I am going to need a bigger shelf." She closed the notebook. She felt clear, the way the mountain felt clear when the clouds pulled back. She was going to stay. She was going to figure out what came next, and she was going to do it carefully and honestly and without rushing. Because she was a physician and she was practical and she did not make major decisions without evidence. She had evidence. She had 13 items. She had more than enough. The evening passed quietly. She had no patience after the afternoon's rounds. She updated her files. She added water to the rosemary bowl. She sat at her desk as the light went out of the mountain sky and the torches in the corridor brightened by contrast, and she thought, with a kind of steady warmth, about nothing in particular. She heard the study door open at around the hour before bed. She heard footsteps cross the corridor to the north window, which she now knew was where he went when the day had been difficult. She heard him stop there. She heard the window open briefly, a moment of mountain air and then the close of it again. She heard him return. He stopped outside her door. He did not knock. He stood there for a moment. She could feel through the wood of the door, a presence without sound, a decision being made or unmade or made differently. She sat very still. He moved away, the study door, the quiet. She breathed. She put her hand on the door handle on her side. She did not turn it. She let her hand rest there for a moment, palm against the iron, and then she lifted her hand away. Not yet. She went to bed with the 2 pieces of sea glass on the table beside her, blue and blue-green, faintly catching the last light. In the morning, Bishop was on the windowsill with a small twist of dried heather, the second heather since the first, and the purple of it against the gray of him against the gray-white of the mountain morning was a color combination she had not seen before and found, without question, beautiful. She opened the window and let him in. He stepped inside without hesitation and walked the length of her windowsill with the proprietary confidence of something that has decided this is also his space. He placed the heather at the end of the row. He looked at her. She said, "Thank you." He ruffled, he settled. He looked at the rosemary on the shelf with what she could only describe as satisfaction. "Did you know about the plant?" she asked. He looked at her. "Did you have anything to do with the plant?" He looked away, the way a person looks away when the question is getting close to something they are not required to confirm. "I see," she said. She gave him a small piece of the walnut from her breakfast, which she had been carrying on the theory that this moment would come eventually. He ate it with clean efficiency. "I'm going to stay," she told him, "in case you're tracking that." He looked at her with his pale, specific, completely unreadable eyes. Then he said, clearly and with the care of something that had been practicing, "Good." One word. She stared at him. He ruffled his feathers one more time, stepped to the window edge and was gone. She sat at her desk with the small twist of heather in her hand, and the mountain bright and cold outside the window. Good. She was going to have to start keeping better track of what he knew. She picked up her pen. She wrote item 15, second heather, and then below it in a different hand than usual, slightly larger, Bishop said good. She underlined it. She went to the east wing still holding the heather, which she did not realize until she was halfway there and could not decide what to do with it except keep it in her pocket with the glass. She pressed her hand against her coat as she walked, 3 things in her pocket, glass, glass, heather. She was a physician, she was practical, she had evidence, she was staying. The mountain was very beautiful in the morning light, white above the walls, clear above the pale sky, exactly like something she had not known she was looking for and had found anyway without looking. She pushed open the east wing door. She went to work. The head healer caught her on a Wednesday. Not caught her exactly, intersected her. In the passageway between the east wing and the main corridor, where Lyra was carrying a case of bandaging materials that needed to be restocked, and healer Edith was coming from the other direction with the expression of someone who has been arranging their words for some time and is now ready to say them. Edith was 60 years old, small and square-shouldered, with white hair she kept in a practical braid and hands that were still the precise, steady hands of someone who had been doing medical work for 4 decades. She had been Lyra's superior for the 2 months since the posting, and they had developed a workable professional relationship characterized by mutual competence and minimal conversation that went beyond the clinical. Today was going to be different. Lyra could see it in the way Edith stopped walking when she saw her. "Set those down," Edith said. Lyra set the case down on the passage floor. Edith looked at her in the careful way of someone who respects the person they are about to be honest with. She said, "I am going to tell you something that is not my business to tell you." Lyra said, "All right. The king has not allowed that bird in an advisory meeting in the 4 years I have been here. Animals in formal meetings are not the custom. Bishop goes where he likes in the rest of the stronghold, but the war chamber and the formal meeting rooms have always been his limit." Lyra said nothing. "Last week during the third treaty review," Edith said, "the morning review, Bishop was in the war chamber. He sat on the arm of the chair at the end of the table." She paused. "Your chair was empty. You had not been invited to that meeting. There would be no medical reason to invite you to that meeting." Lyra was very still. Edith said, "It is not my business. I want to be clear about that." She looked at Lyra with 60 years of experience and a particular kind of steadiness that came from having seen a great many things. "But I have been at Caldenmere long enough to know that the North Corridor posting was unusual from the day it was arranged, and that 3 of the household staff have had a long-standing informal agreement to restock the small shelf in that office before any new physician's assistant takes the room, and that no physician's assistant has used that room in 11 years, and that the restocking was done 6 days before you arrived." Lyra looked at her. Edith looked back. "He knew you were coming," Lyra said. "He approved every posting to the stronghold," Edith said. "He has done so for the past 7 years. You would have been approved the same as anyone else." "But he knew specifically," Lyra said. Edith said the shelf was restocked, the room was aired. "The locked door between the study and that office has not been locked from the study side for 11 years. If it were locked from the study side, no one could put a key in the study side lock to confirm." She said this entirely without emphasis, as a series of facts. "I checked the study side lock the day you arrived." The air in the passage was very quiet. Lyra said it was unlocked. "It was unlocked," Edith said, "from the study side." She picked up the bandaging case and handed it to Lyra with the same precise, calm efficiency she brought to everything. "That is all I wanted to say," she said. "It is not my business, but I find I am considerably invested in whether you remain at this posting." She met Lyra's eyes with the direct honesty of someone who has decided to be clear. "You're the best physician's assistant we've had in 6 years. That is also relevant." She walked back down the passage. Lyra stood with the bandaging case and looked at the space Edith had vacated. The door had been unlocked from the study side. Not locked with no key on her side, unlocked with deliberate intention from the other side. She had been living in a room with a door that he had opened before she arrived. She walked to the storage room and restocked the bandages. She did it mechanically, her hands doing the familiar work while her mind sat with this information and turned it over the way she turned the moon button over, slow and thorough and looking for the edges. He had known she was coming. He had known, and he had unlocked the door, and he had arranged the room, and on the first day he had seen her in the corridor and said her name like something he had already placed exactly where it belonged. She put the last of the bandages away. She went back to her office. She sat at her desk. She looked at the locked door. She already knew it was not locked from his side. She had not tried her side. She had not tried because not trying was a form of control, a form of deciding not to know something until she was ready to know it. She was not sure she was ready. She was sure that she was getting there. She opened her blue notebook. She wrote "door unlocked from his side before I arrived." Below that, the shelf, the room, the airing 6 days before. Below that, he arranged this. She read it back. She said out loud, "He arranged this." The room did not confirm or deny. She closed the notebook. She stood up. She put her coat on and went outside into the mountain cold, which was what she did when she needed to think without walls around her. The courtyard was partly clear of snow, the center swept, the edges still white, and the sky above the stronghold's walls was a brilliant and uncompromising blue. She stood in the cold and she breathed. He was the Alpha King of Caldenmere. He was a man who sat alone at the right end of the head table and ate only when someone brought him bread, and managed a stronghold on a mountain in a border territory, and had not, by any account she had gathered, ever brought someone directly to himself. Not in 7 years of approved postings and advisory arrangements and treaty meetings. He had unlocked a door. He had sent a bird with a moon button and a pressed flower and a map of her home. He had not said a single direct word about any of it. She breathed out into the cold. She thought about what it cost a person to say something directly. She knew this cost. She had been paying it for years, in the way she kept her observations in the back of notebooks and used medical shorthand for feelings and told herself she was documenting anomalies when she was doing something else entirely. She knew exactly what it cost. She went back inside. She went to her room. She sat down. She wrote in the blue notebook at the top of a fresh page, "What am I waiting for?" She looked at the question for a long time. Then she got up and went to the great hall early and sat and waited for dinner. And when it started, she ate her meal and watched the room with her professional eyes and noted Owen's slightly overbright manner, which usually meant news he was trying not to share before the right moment, and Gareth's flat composure, which was its own kind of news, and Edith at the far end of the physician's table, who looked at Lyra once and then looked away with the expression of someone who has said what they needed to say. Callum arrived after most people had started eating. He went to the head table. He took his seat at the far right end. He was in a slightly more formal version of his usual dark clothing, which meant a meeting had run late into the evening. His face showed nothing. It never showed anything to the room. She had learned to read the very small things instead: the set of his jaw, the way his hands rested on the table, the particular stillness that was either very calm or very controlled. Tonight his hands were still. Tonight a woman was sitting beside him. Lyra noted this. She noted it without reaction, with professional neutrality, in the way she noted all information as information rather than as something that had weight. The woman was perhaps 35, dressed with the kind of understated elegance that spoke of long practice. She had dark hair and a composed face, and she was saying something to Callum with the ease of someone who knew how to hold his attention. He was listening, or appearing to listen. His face was the same as always. Lyra looked at her soup. She was not going to make assumptions about who this woman was. She ate 3 more spoonfuls. Agnes materialized at her elbow because Agnes materialized at places where information was relevant. She said, quietly and without being asked, "Lord Darrow's daughter. She's been here twice this season for the trade negotiations. She's been quite determined to be noticed." She set a piece of bread on the table. 8 months from what I hear. Lyra said, "That's not my business." Agnes said, in the tone of someone who disagreed but was too polite to say so directly. She drifted away. Lyra ate her soup. She was a physician, she was rational. She had evidence, and she had made a decision, and she was not going to let one dinner arrangement displace all of that. She looked up once at the head table. The woman was speaking again, animated with a skill that Lyra recognized as genuine charm, the kind that came from practice and intelligence. She was not performing. She meant what she was saying. She was also clearly interested in the man she was saying it to. Callum listened. He did not look at her the way he looked at Lyra's table when he thought she was not watching. Lyra looked back at her soup. She noted this without making anything of it. She ate the rest of her meal without looking up again and went back to the north corridor, and in her room she found on the desk a small piece of paper with 3 words in precise handwriting. The handwriting she knew now. The words were still counting. She sat down. She looked at the paper. She looked at the locked door. She picked up her pen. She wrote below it always. She put it on the windowsill. She went to bed, and she did not toss, and she did not count things, and she slept all the way through until first bell, which had not happened since she arrived. She woke feeling, for the first time in a very long time, like she knew exactly where she was. The morning was clear and still. She dressed and went to the East Wing and saw 2 patients whose conditions were routine and easily managed, and she had Edith review a 3rd case with her that required a second opinion, and Edith gave it with the same precise efficiency she brought to everything and did not once reference the conversation in the passage. On her way back at mid-morning, she found Lord Darrow's daughter in the north corridor. Not pacing, not lost, standing with a considered composure that made it clear she had chosen to be here. She was a well-made woman, close in age to Lyra, with eyes that assessed very quickly and then settled into something less guarded once the assessment was complete. She looked at Lyra and said, "You're the physician's assistant." Lyra said, "Yes." The woman said, "I'm Cecily, Darrow's daughter, if that context helps." She did not say it with any expectation that the title would impress. She said it the way you give someone information they probably already have so that you can move past the pleasantries. Lyra said, "It does. Can I help you with something?" Cecily looked at her for a moment. She had, Lyra noted, the look of someone who has spent a long time being strategic in rooms and knows when they are in a room with someone who is not going to be strategic back, and finds this both challenging and refreshing. She said, "No. I was actually wondering if I could be useful to you." Lyra said, "In what sense?" "In the sense," Cecily said, with a precision that Lyra found herself immediately respecting, "that I have been coming to this stronghold for 8 months, and I have made a sincere effort to understand its particular dynamics." She paused on the word the way a person pauses on a word when the real word they want to use would be too direct. "And I have some observations that I think are probably relevant to you." "Why to me?" Cecily looked at her with an expression that walked up to the edge of amusement and stopped there. She said, "Because I have been in the Great Hall on 9 separate evenings, and I have watched a man who does not look at anything directly look at your table every single evening, and last night was the first evening he didn't, and I think we both know why." The corridor was very quiet. Lyra said, "He was speaking to you." "He was listening to me," Cecily corrected. "Those are different things. He is a perfectly courteous listener. He listens to everyone with the same attention." She folded her hands in front of her. "It is not the same attention." Lyra said, "I see." "I want to be clear," Cecily said, with the directness of someone who has decided that clearly is the only useful way to speak. "I have no interest in making this complicated. I am a practical woman. I came here with my father's interests and my own, and I have made a clear-eyed assessment of all of them." She met Lyra's eyes. "He looks at you the way people look at something they have decided about. He has been looking at you the whole time I have been here. I would have had to work very hard not to notice." Lyra looked back at her. Cecily said, "I'm not telling you this to be kind. I'm telling you because I would have wanted someone to tell me if the situation were reversed, and I believe in the general principle of that." She began moving down the corridor. "Good morning, Lyra Voss." She was gone before Lyra could respond. Lyra stood in the corridor. She thought about the way he had looked at her after the 11 minutes of bread and salt and silence. She thought about a note that said "still counting." She thought about a door unlocked from the other side before she arrived. She went into her room. Bishop was on the windowsill, which was no longer a surprise. He had something in his beak. He placed it on the sill and stepped back. A piece of string, old, good quality once, the kind used for binding important documents gone soft with age. She picked it up and looked at it. A string, what did a string mean? She looked at Bishop. He said very clearly a phrase she had not heard him say before, "All of them." She stared at him. He ruffled once and flew. She stood at the window with the string in her hand. "All of them." She looked at her desk. The row had grown too long for the desk and had spilled to the shelf beside the rosemary plant. Flower, button, feather, parchment, stones, bark, gray feather, plant, sea glass, heather, heather, map, piece, string. 15 items and a growing plant and a bowl of water. The whole accumulation of 7 weeks. All of them. She picked up the moon button, the button she always picked up. She said to the room, to the locked door, to the string and the button and the pressed flower, "All right, I'm going to knock." She set the button down. She crossed the room. She stood at the locked door. She raised her hand. She stopped. She thought about this very carefully for 10 seconds. She thought he unlocked it from his side. He could have knocked any time in 7 weeks. He has not knocked. Bishop speaks for him in the way that Bishop speaks for him, and he writes 3 words on a piece of paper and sends it through a bird, and he eats bread in silence for 11 minutes, and he looks at her when she is not looking. She lowered her hand. She went back to her desk. She picked up her pen. She wrote on a new piece of paper, "I know about the door." She put it at the window. She was not going to knock, not tonight. But she was going to let him know that she knew. That was different from knocking. That was its own kind of door opening. She went to dinner with a steadier pulse than she had had in weeks. She was going to let him know. And then she was going to see what he did with the knowing. She was a physician. She understood that some treatments required the patient to make the final move. She was, for the first time, comfortable with waiting. At dinner she ate without watching the head table, and she talked briefly to Agnes and at greater length to Owen, who had discovered a mutual interest in the biology of mountain plants, and who had opinions about the rosemary that she found legitimately interesting. She went back early. The note was gone from the window. In its place was nothing. She waited. Morning came. On her desk was the door key from the study side, plain iron, old, placed in the center of her desk exactly where the pressed flower had been on the first day. She picked it up. She held it. She looked at the door. She looked at the key. She said, "Oh." She set the key on the desk. She sat down. She was shaking again, the small internal shaking that she was not going to document, and she pressed both hands flat on the desk and breathed until it stopped. He had given her the key. He had not knocked. He had not opened the door from his side. He had given her the key, which meant the next move was entirely and completely hers. She looked at it for a long time. Then she picked it up and put it in her coat pocket with the sea glass and the heather. She went to work. She did not open the door. Not today. But the key was in her pocket, and the mountain was clear and white above the stronghold walls, and Bishop called from somewhere in the north corridor, a single bright sound, and she walked through the cold morning air with her hand pressed against her coat pocket and the specific warm weight of iron against her palm, and she thought, "When I am ready." She was close. She was very close. She carried the key for 3 days before she used it. 3 days in her coat pocket alongside the sea glass and the heather, 3 days of her hand finding it when she put her coat on and taking the small, deliberate inventory of everything in that pocket the way she took inventory of her medical kit each morning. Key, glass, heather, present, accounted for. On the 3rd day, she woke at the deep middle of the night to the sound of footsteps in the corridor. Not unusual. The stronghold had guards and the north corridor had its rotation, and footsteps were simply part of the ambient sound of a building that was occupied at all hours. She had learned to sleep through them. These were not guard footsteps. She knew his footsteps. She had been learning them for 2 months without meaning to, the same way she had learned the specific quality of his voice through the wall and the particular 3-inch angle of the study door when he had been reading for a while and had let it drift. His footsteps were steady and unhurried and had a specific pace, not long or short, just his, the pace of a man who moved through his own space with no performance attached to it. These were his footsteps, passing her door, going to the north window at the end of the corridor. She lay still. She heard him stop at the window. She heard the window open. The brief cold rush of mountain air, muffled by 2 walls but still felt, the temperature drop of an opened high-altitude window at night. Then the close. He stayed at the window for some time. She looked at the ceiling. She thought about "Have you slept?" She thought about the supply records that showed he had not slept during the border crisis. She thought about Gareth's comment about the lights in the study. She thought about a man at the head table, with an untouched meal, who had eaten every piece of bread she brought him. She got up. She put on her coat in the dark. She found the key in her pocket without looking. She went to the locked door. She put the key in the lock. She turned it. The door opened. The study was dark except for the low light of the banked fire in the grate and a single lamp left burning low on the desk. Books everywhere in the order she had noted was not alphabetical or by size, but some other logic she had never been close enough to read. A wide desk. A chair by the fire that showed the particular wear of something sat in often and for long periods. Bishop's large perch in the far corner, currently empty. She crossed the study to the second door that led to the corridor. She opened it. He was at the north window. His back was to her. He was dressed but not for anything formal, the plain dark clothes again, the ones that were just his clothes without ceremony. His hands were on the window frame on either side, not leaning, just resting. He was looking at the mountain. She said, "Can't sleep." He turned. His face in the low night light of the corridor torches was, she thought, the most honest she had seen it. Not because it showed more, because it did not show less. Because it simply was what it was, without the layer of composed distance that the daytime applied. He looked at her with the gray eyes that were the mountain before a storm, and he said nothing. She said, "You should come inside. The cold at this hour doesn't help." He said, "You're up." "I heard you," she said. He looked at her, at the coat she had put on, at the door to the study she had come through. She said, "You gave me the key." "Yes," he said. "So I used it," she said. He was quiet for a moment, then he stepped back from the window and turned toward the study door. She went first. She went back through the study to the fire, which was low but not out, and she crouched down and added 2 small logs from the stack beside the grate, not asking, just doing it, because the fire needed it and she was there. She heard him come in behind her. She heard the study door to the corridor close. She stood up. She turned around. He was standing in the center of his study, looking at her with the expression of a man who has prepared for a great many things, and has found that preparation does not actually describe the particular reality of a thing happening. She looked around the room. She looked at the books, the desk, the worn chair by the fire, Bishop's empty perch. She looked at the desk, where there was a single sheet of paper with something written on it in the precise dark blue handwriting she knew. She looked at the sheet of paper. She said, "What's on the paper?" He said, "Nothing you need to see tonight." She said, "That means it's relevant." He said, "It means it's for a different conversation." She looked at him. "How many conversations are you planning?" He said very quietly, "As many as you want to have." The fire had caught the new logs and the light in the room shifted, warmer, the shadows moving differently. Bishop arrived from somewhere she hadn't tracked, landing on his perch without ceremony, folding his wings, fixing them both with his pale eyes. She said, "I've been counting things." He said, "I know." 15 items, she said, "not counting the plant." He said, 16 with the key." She looked at him. "You kept the key," he said. "I did." "That was a separate item," he said. She said, "You've been counting too." He looked at her with the direct gray look that had no corridor between them and no meal to put in front of them and nothing to defer to. Just the two of them and the fire and a gray parrot watching from a perch. He said, "From the beginning." She said, "The shelf was restocked before I arrived." A pause. "Yes." "The room was aired." "Yes." "You left the door unlocked." He said, "I wasn't certain you'd want it that way. If you had locked it from your side, I would have understood." She said, "I didn't lock it from my side." "No," he said, "you didn't." The fire shifted. Bishop made the low sound, the considering sound, and settled deeper into his perch. She said, "Why didn't you knock? In 2 months the whole time." He was quiet for a moment, not avoiding the question. Choosing words the way someone chooses words when they have been thinking about them for a long time, and have found that the precise truth is harder to say than the approximate one. He said, "I have been through a version of making a decision that wasn't a decision. A long time ago, I decided I would not go through that again." She said, "What does that mean?" He said, "It means I was not going to come through a door you had not opened." She looked at him. She said, "The flower was on my desk before I arrived." "Bishop puts things where he thinks they should go," Callum said. "I didn't place the flower, I left it where it was." "But you knew it was there." "I left it where it was," he said again, which was not quite the same as saying he hadn't known. She said, "The parchment. The blank one." "I sent it," he said. "I didn't write anything on it because I didn't know what to write. I wanted you to have something from me without it being—" He stopped, started again, "without it being something you had to respond to before you were ready." She said, "A blank page." "A blank page," he said. She thought about this for a moment. She thought about writing "Y" on it and folding it back along the exact creases. She thought about receiving a gray feather in return. She said, "And when I wrote on it, you sent a feather." "Bishop's answer," he said, "not mine." "What was your answer?" He looked at her directly, "The same one." She breathed. She said, I wrote I've been counting on the next note. I know, he said. And you sent still counting? Yes. And I wrote always. He said yes, and then after a pause, I kept it. She stood by his fire in his study with the moth-eaten logic of 2 months of objects and locked doors, and a grey parrot who said good and all of them. And she looked at the man who had arranged all of it from a distance of a wall and 3 inches of open door, and she thought, this is what it looks like when someone who does not know how to begin, begins. She said, what's on the paper? He looked at the desk. He said, it's a list. She said, of what? He said, things I've been learning about you, from when Bishop reports back. She stared at him, Bishop reports back. Callum looked at the parrot. Bishop looked at the ceiling. She said, what does he report? Callum said that you talk to him like a colleague, that you reorganize the items on your desk when you're thinking, that you've been keeping a second notebook, that you laugh at yourself when you're alone and you think no one can hear. He looked back at her, that the rosemary is doing well. She said, he can't tell you all of that. Callum said very carefully, he has a good vocabulary. She looked at Bishop. Bishop very deliberately examined the wall. She pressed her hand over her mouth. She was not going to laugh. She breathed carefully and steadily and did not laugh. She said, he has been reporting on me. He reports on everything, Callum said. It's not specific. She looked at the list on the desk. She said, can I read it? He said no, and then not tonight. She said, then what do you suggest I do with tonight? He looked at her with the settled, decided look. He said, sit by the fire, the chair is comfortable, I'll make tea. She said, you'll make tea. The kitchen staff don't work past the 9th hour, he said, and I've been making my own tea since long before I ran this stronghold. She looked at him. He looked back. She took off her coat and put it over the back of the worn chair by the fire and sat down. He went to the small table by the window where there was a small iron kettle and a set of cups, and he made tea without fuss or ceremony, and Bishop watched them both from his perch with the expression of a creature who has been engineering something for 2 months and is finding the result satisfactory. Callum brought the tea. He sat in the chair across from the fire, the chair at the desk pulled slightly forward. He handed her a cup. She took it. She said, you're going to have to actually talk to me, you know. He said, I know. She said, not through a bird. He said, I know. She waited. He looked at the fire. He said, I have spent 7 years making decisions that affect a great many people. I have learned to be certain before I say things, because what I say carries weight I cannot take back. She said, and? He said, and I am certain about very few things, but I am certain that I have been waiting for you to open that door since the day you arrived, and I am certain that sitting in the same room with you right now is, he stopped, he tried again, is exactly what it feels like. She looked at him. He looked at her. Bishop made the low, considering sound. She said, good start. He almost smiled. Almost. She drank her tea by his fire, and he drank his, and they talked. Not about the items, not about the door, not about 7 weeks of accumulated objects and careful distances. They talked the way 2 people talk when they have been in each other's vicinity for long enough that they already know some things and are only now beginning to say them out loud. She told him about the valley, about training, about the particular loneliness of being good at your work, in a place where your work keeps you slightly apart from everyone. He told her about the border territories, about the weight of decisions, about the particular quality of silence that a mountain gives you that no other landscape does. Bishop fell asleep somewhere in the 2nd hour. They talked until the fire burned low again. She stood up to go. He stood too. She picked up her coat. He said her name, Lyra, just her name, without the clinical surname that had been the first word she heard from him. Just Lyra. She turned. He said, leave the door unlocked. She looked at him for a moment. She said, it was never locked from my side. She went through the study door. She did not lock the door behind her. In the morning, she added nothing to the log. Some things were past documenting. She went to the east wing at first bell, and she was late because she had slept through first bell for the first time since arriving, and Edith looked at her when she came in with a single arched eyebrow that communicated a great deal without requiring any words. Lyra said, "The fire in the study is very warm." Edith looked at her for exactly 2 seconds. She said, "I see," and handed her a patient file and walked away. Owen took one look at Lyra's face when he came in for the weekly check that Lyra had kept scheduling because she liked his commentary and said, "Something happened." She said, "Nothing happened." He said, "Something happened." She said, "Owen." He said, "I'm very happy for you." And then he talked about the uneven table legs for 10 minutes while she checked his arm, which was completely unnecessary at this point, but which she documented as a wellness visit to make it official. And she found herself not listening to the table legs commentary, but thinking about a worn chair by a fire and a man who had learned to make his own tea long before he needed to. She released Owen from all future treatment requirements. He looked moderately disappointed. She went back to the north corridor at midday. The study door was open, 3 inches in the position she knew as the reading position, the position she had been tracking for 2 months from the corridor. She paused at the door. She said through the 3-inch gap, "Are you sleeping?" There was a pause. Then his voice from inside, even an unhurried, "Reading." She said, "Eat something." A longer pause. He said, "You're not currently on duty." She said, "Eat something anyway." She went into her room. She heard, a few minutes later, the sound of him getting up. She heard him cross to the small table by the window. She heard the specific sounds of someone assembling a meal from what was there rather than going all the way to the kitchen. She opened her notebook. She did not write anything in it. She sat with it open and looked at the rosemary on her shelf, which had grown noticeably in the past 3 weeks and was starting to need a larger pot. She thought about last night. She thought about leaving the door unlocked. She thought about Lyra, just that. Her name said like a decision that had already been made. She closed the notebook. She thought, going to need to stop carrying the sea glass in her pocket before she wore the finish off it. She left it on the desk. She went to her afternoon patients. She came back in the evening, and the study door was still 3 inches open, and the smell of rosemary from her shelf mixed with the pine resin from the corridor torches and the cold mountain smell from under the outer door. And she sat at her desk in this small accumulation of smells that had become, over 2 months, the specific smell of this particular place, and she thought, yes. This was a thought that didn't need completing. Just yes. She watered the rosemary. She went to dinner. He was at the head table. He was in the position she knew. He spoke to Prudence on his right with his usual contained efficiency. He looked at her table at some point during the meal. She caught it. She looked back. He looked away. She looked away. Agnes appeared with a piece of bread. "I didn't order that," Lyra said. "No," Agnes said. "It came from the kitchen with a note from the cook. Marjorie says you've been skipping the bread course." She set it down. "She is apparently tracking this." Lyra looked at the bread. She thought about a plate of bread and salt. She thought about 11 minutes. She thought about Marjorie asking no for the north corridor and adding something warm without being asked. She looked up at the head table. He was not looking at her. But there was the smallest thing at the edge of his expression, so small she might have missed it 2 months ago, so small she would not have had the vocabulary for it 2 months ago. Not quite a smile. The thing a person's face does when they have decided to find something amusing and have not decided yet whether to show it. She ate the bread. She thought about how many people in this stronghold had been paying attention the whole time. She thought about 2 separate observations, 3 out of 3, stay, good instincts. She thought about Edith and Corin and Gareth and Marjorie and Dora and Agnes and Owen, all of them circling the same thing from different angles for 2 months, all of them patient, all of them, she understood now, waiting for her to find what they had already seen. She was the last person to know, which was, she supposed, usually how it went when you were in the middle of it rather than looking at it from the outside. She was comfortable with that. She was very comfortable with most things tonight. She went back to the north corridor. She went to her room. She looked at the moon button on her desk. She picked it up. She crossed to the locked door. She unlocked it from her side. She pushed it open. The study was empty, he was still at dinner. She set the moon button on his desk, in the center where the flower had been on her desk. She went back into her room, she left the door open between them. She sat at her desk. She waited. She heard him return an hour later. She heard him come into the study, she heard him stop. A long silence. Then his voice, very quiet, not directed at her, just into the study, just the word, "Oh." Just that. She pressed her hand over her heart. She was going to need to stop pressing her hand over her heart at things, or she was never going to finish her patient notes. She picked up her pen. She wrote in the blue notebook at the top of a fresh page, "I have no more items to add to this list." She looked at it. She added, "I have everything else instead." She closed the notebook. In the study, Bishop made the low, satisfied sound of something that has finished a long project and found the result precisely as intended. She found the archive record on a Thursday. Not hunting for it. She was reviewing a patient's family medical history, which required checking the general records that the stronghold maintained on long-standing residents and their households, and the record system required her to go through 3 adjacent years of documentation to find the specific entry she needed. She was thorough. She was always thorough. She went through all 3 years. The betrothal record was in the middle year. It was filed under family contracts, not under court records, not under political arrangements, under family contracts which told her something about who had filed it and what they had wanted to call it. The entry was brief, names and dates and a one-line description of the arrangement's conclusion, contract dissolved by mutual parties 7th month, no further notes. She read the name of the woman. She put the file back. She sat at the records room table for a moment. Agnes was across the room and not paying her any attention, working through a catalog revision with the focus of someone who took her work seriously. Lyra said, Agnes. Agnes said, There's a record in the family contracts for about 7 years ago, she said. A dissolution, was that person here, at the stronghold? Agnes looked up. She looked at Lyra with a reading expression, the way Agnes looked at things that required her to decide how much information to share. She said, for 3 years, during the early border period when things were difficult, she paused. She left when it became clear the border situation wasn't going to resolve quickly and the political risks were significant. Lyra said she left because the situation was bad. That's one way of saying it, Agnes said, without unkindness toward anyone. She looked at Lyra. It was a long time ago. I know, Lyra said. Agnes went back to her catalogue. Lyra walked back to the north corridor. She walked slowly because she was thinking, and walking slowly was the physical expression of thinking carefully. She had not known about this. She had known about a long time ago, from that single sentence he had offered by the fire, a version of making a decision that wasn't a decision. She had not asked him to clarify because she had known, in the way you know things from the way they are said, that he had given her the amount he was ready to give. She understood now what that sentence meant. She understood the blank parchment, the deliberate distances, the door unlocked from his side but never opened, the bird going room to room with its deliveries, doing what a person cannot do when they do not know how to begin again after someone has taught them that beginning is dangerous. She sat at her desk. She looked at the open door to the study. He was not in there. He was in the war chamber, she knew, for an afternoon session. She could sit in his study and look at his books and his worn chair, and the ring on the desk from years of his evening cup of tea, and think about what it cost a person to arrange a room for someone they had not met, and unlock a door that had been locked for 7 years and wait, with the particular patience of someone who was very tired of making decisions alone. She did not go into the study, not without him there. She sat at her desk. She picked up the blue notebook. She opened it to the page that said, I have no more items to add to this list. I have everything else instead. She read it. She closed the notebook. She thought about the woman whose name was in the records room. She thought about her without anger, because anger was not what this called for, and because she did not have all the facts, and because 7 years was a long time to carry something, and because the only person she needed to consider was the person on the other side of the open door. She went to the evening meal. He was there. He looked as he often looked, like a man who had spent the afternoon in a room that required things from him and had given them fully. He ate with more consistency than he had on the treaty night. He spoke to Prudence. He spoke briefly to Gareth, which she noted as unusual. He looked at her table. She looked back. He did not look away first, neither did she. After a moment, he went back to his meal. She went back to hers. Owen was there, and he said something very interesting about a new approach to the mountain plant documentation that he had been reading about, and she actually listened, because it was actually interesting, which was a measure of how much things had changed from the weeks when Owen's commentary was something she tracked as a social indicator. She went back early. She went to her room. The study door was open. She went through it. He came back an hour later, and she was sitting in the worn chair by the fire with a book she had borrowed from the shelf without asking, which she had determined he would not object to based on the evidence of 16 items and a list of things Bishop had told him. She had chosen a natural history of the mountains, which she had been meaning to find for months. He came in and stopped. He looked at her. She said, "Is this all right?" He said yes, and then without any additional preamble he went to the kettle. She read the natural history of the mountains. He made tea. He brought her a cup. He sat in the other chair, the one he had pulled forward the night they talked for the first time, and he opened a document from his desk and read it, and they sat in the same room in silence that was not the silence of two people who had nothing to say, but the silence of two people who did not need to fill every moment. Bishop slept on his perch. The fire burned. At some point Lyra looked up from her book and said, without planning to say it, "I found a record today, in the archives." He looked up. She said, "A family contract, 7 years ago." He was still. She said, "I wasn't looking for it, I was doing patient history research." She looked at him. "I wanted you to know I know, I'm not going to ask you to explain it." He was quiet for a long moment. Then he said, "She made a rational decision given the information she had at the time. I understood it." Lyra said, "That's a very generous reading." He said, "I've had 7 years to get to generous." She said, "And before generous?" He said, "Other things." She looked at him. He looked at the document in his hands, not reading it, just holding it, the way you hold something when you need something to do with your hands. She said, "You unlocked the door before I arrived." He said, "Yes." She said, "Before you met me." He said, "I read the postings, I review all of them, I read yours and I thought." He stopped. He started again with the careful precision of someone saying a true thing that is also difficult. "I thought that I would like to meet someone who documented things the way you documented things, and I thought I would like to have a person in that room again, and I knew that was two different thoughts and I was trying to be honest with myself about which one was driving the unlocking." She looked at him. He said, "It was both." She said, "And now?" He met her eyes. He said, "And now I know you reorganize your desk when you're thinking and you laugh at yourself alone, and you talk to Bishop like a colleague, and you went to Marjorie for bread when I couldn't eat my meal. And now, it is considerably less both and considerably more specific." She breathed. She said, "You have a list." He said, "I have a list." She said, "Can I read it now?" He looked at her for a moment. Then he stood up, went to the desk, picked up the folded paper she had first seen the night she came through the door and brought it across the room. He held it out. She took it. She unfolded it. She read it. It was 2 pages, close handwriting, the dark blue ink she knew. The list began with, "Talks to Bishop like he can answer her back," and ended with, at the bottom of the second page in slightly different pressure, like something added more recently, "Brought me bread when I couldn't eat and sat beside me and didn't say anything that needed saying." She folded it back along the original creases. She held it. She said, "This is a very good list." He said, "It's incomplete." She said, "Everything is incomplete." He said, "Yes," and then, "But some things are worth continuing." She looked at the list in her hands. She looked at him. She said, "Yes." She put the list in her coat pocket, beside the key and the sea glass and the dried heather. He sat back down. She read her book. He read his document. Bishop slept. In the morning she went to the east wing and she did her work and she was very good at it, and she came back and the door was open and she went through it, because the door was open, and she sat in the worn chair, and she was, for the first time in a long time, completely certain where she was and what she was doing there. She was home. She understood this without any fanfare and without needing to write it down, which was its own kind of evidence. She picked up her book. She read. The next 2 weeks were not dramatic in any way she would have predicted. She had spent 2 months in a state of careful observation and deliberate not concluding and accumulated evidence, and she had expected the resolution of that state to feel like something definitive, a change in the weather, a before and an after. Instead, it felt like a continuation, like something that had already been happening becoming visible. They ate breakfast separately, because he was usually in the war chamber by first bell and she was usually in the east wing by the same time, and they had their separate professional lives that were both demanding and both serious, and she did not find this difficult. She found it entirely natural. She had been good at her work before Caldenmere and she was good at her work in it, and she did not need to reshape her professional self around any other arrangement. She found that he understood this without being told. She found that he arranged nothing that assumed she would be elsewhere. He did not, for example, ask her to attend anything that was not medically relevant. He did not introduce her to his advisors with any particular framing. He did not make announcements. He was, she came to see, very careful about the line between his decisions and hers. Owen noticed that she smiled more. He said this one morning while she was checking a patient, and it came out with the warmth and directness of someone who simply wanted to say a good thing to a person they liked. She said, "Thank you, Owen," and he said, "Gareth owes me 3 coins, and she said, "Were you running a bet?" And he said, "Gareth bet autumn, I bet spring, neither of us were exactly right, so it's complicated." And she laughed genuinely without managing it. She went back to the north corridor still laughing faintly. She told Callum that evening about the bet. He listened with the carefully composed face he used for things he found amusing but had not yet decided to show. Then he said, "Gareth is usually right about things." She said, "He said autumn." He said he was referring to when I knew. She looked at him. He looked at the fire. "When did you know?" she said. He said, "When you went back to Marjorie for just bread and salt." He paused. "Plain, you specifically asked for plain." She said, "I didn't want you to feel." She stopped. He said, "Like you were managing me." She said, "Yes." He said, "I know, I understood that at the time." She said, "And that was autumn." He said, "First month treaty crisis." He looked at her. "Gareth was right." She said, "I'm going to tell Owen that Gareth wins and watch Owen's face." The almost smile came through fully then, just briefly, just enough. She considered that face, that brief not quite smile, and thought that she had been collecting evidence since the beginning, and this, tonight, was more than evidence. She reached across and touched the back of his hand lightly, just for a moment. He turned his hand over. She left hers there. Bishop watched from the perch with the expression of something that has invested considerable time and effort, and is finding the return precisely adequate. They sat by the fire for another hour. In the morning, she watered the rosemary and looked at the empty space on her desk where the row of objects had been. She had moved them all to the study, to a small shelf she had asked if she could use, and he had simply said yes, and she had arranged them there. Flower, button, feathers, stones, bark, glass pieces, heathers, map, string, and key. The key she had put back. It lived on the shelf now with the others. The door between the rooms was open. She looked at it. She thought about the first morning, the flower on the center of the desk, the window that showed a thin slice of mountain sky, the held breath quiet of the north corridor. She thought about all of it. She picked up her coat and went to the east wing. Edith was already there. She said without preamble, "You look well." Lyra said, "I am well." Edith looked at her with 60 years of observation. She said, "Good." She handed her a case file. She walked away. Lyra opened the case file. She went to work. She was very good at her work. She was very good at several things she had learned, at documenting anomalies, at sitting in silence, at playing bread at midnight, at carrying things in her pocket until she knew what to do with them, at staying. She went through the east wing with her patient notebook, and her practiced efficiency, and the specific warmth of someone who has arrived somewhere and recognized it. And in the north corridor, behind an open door, a gray parrot sat on his perch and watched the morning come in through the study window, pale and clear. The way mountain mornings came in when the weather was settled, and the sky was doing nothing complicated, just being the sky, high and clean, and exactly as large as it needed to be. The rosemary needed a larger pot by the end of that month, just as she had predicted. She mentioned this to Callum in passing one evening, not as anything requiring discussion, just as a fact she was relaying. He said he would see to it. 3 days later there was a new pot on the shelf, twice the size of the old one, with good rich soil already prepared, and the rosemary repotted neatly with none of the root damage that came from careless handling. She had not asked who had done it. She had looked at it for a long time, and then she had watered it and added to the bowl and said nothing. Some things were past asking about. She went to the study and she said, "The rosemary is happy." He was reading, he said without looking up, "Good." She said, "Who repotted it?" He turned a page. She said, "You repotted it." He turned another page. She sat down in the worn chair. She said, "You could have just told me." He said, "It needed doing." She said, "Callum." He looked up. She said, "Thank you." He looked at her for a moment with the settled gray eyes. He said, "You keep it alive." She said, "I keep the bowl filled, you're doing the rest." He said, "We're doing the rest," and went back to his page. She sat with this for a moment. Then she picked up her book. Bishop made the low sound from his perch. She said, "You too, you probably had a role in the repotting." Bishop looked at the window. She shook her head. She read. The fire burned low and neither of them moved to add logs for a while, and the room got slowly cooler in the way of rooms in a mountain stronghold on a winter evening. And at some point, Callum stood and put 2 logs on the fire without comment and sat back down, and the warmth came back up, and neither of them said anything about it. The small, ordinary ways of being in a space with another person. She had not known how much she had missed them. She read her book. He read his. Outside, the mountain held the stronghold in its settled winter weight, white and clear and very old, and the north corridor was quiet, and the torches burned, and behind an open door in the study, something that had taken 7 weeks and a good deal of careful patience had become the most natural thing in the world. She turned a page. She did not document this. Some things were past documentation. She was glad, she thought, that she had not thrown anything away. Spring came to Caldenmere the way spring came to mountain places. Slowly, then all at once, the snow releasing from the high peaks in stages over a period of weeks, and then, one morning, the smell of the air being different, a green note in it that had not been there the day before. Lyra noticed it on her way to the east wing at first bell. She stopped in the courtyard and breathed for a moment, and the morning came into her lungs like a door opening. Then she went to work, because spring changed the clinical picture in specific ways, and she had patients waiting. The spring shift brought different ailments. The first warm days brought people outside who had been inside for 4 months, which brought sprains and falls, and the particular kind of exhaustion that came from bodies adjusting to movement after long stillness. She was busy in a way she liked, the busy of genuine need and good work, and she came back in the evenings with tired hands and a clean mind. He was usually there when she came back. Not always in the study. Sometimes in the corridor, having just returned from the war chamber. Sometimes at the window. Once, memorably, in her room itself, standing at the shelf looking at the rosemary with the expression of a man conducting a private botanical assessment. She had come in and found him there and said, "It's doing well." He had said, "Root growth." She had said, "I know, I moved it to the window for more light last week." He had said, "That helped." She had said, "I know." They had looked at the rosemary together for a moment, and then she had put her bag down and they had gone into the study, and she had sat in the worn chair and he had made tea. It was like this now, the easy ordinariness of it. She would not have predicted 2 months ago that what she most wanted from a man who had sent her 16 objects through a Parrot was simply to sit in a room with him at the end of the day and have nothing required of either of them. But this was, she found, exactly what she wanted. This and other things, but this especially, the simple fact of being in a shared space with someone who did not need filling up with conversation or managing through moods, who was just there. She told him this one evening, not as a declaration, just as an observation. She said, "I didn't know I was this tired of having to be on." He said, "On." She said, "Present for people, in the performing sense. Making the effort." He said, "You don't make that effort with me." She said, "No." He said, "Good." She said, "Is that what it's like for you, with people?" He thought about this for a moment. He said, "Yes, and then almost always." She looked at him. He said, "Not now." She held this carefully. She said, "The list, the things Bishop reported." He said, She said, "Laughing at yourself when you're alone, you wrote that." He said, "Yes." She said, "How did he tell you that?" He looked at Bishop with the expression she had come to recognize as the one reserved specifically for the bird. He said, "He has a vocabulary." She said, "Specifically." He said, "Specifically, he comes back after his rounds and he says things, words that," he paused, "that create an impression." She said, "And laughing." He said, "He came back once from your room and said laughing 3 times, emphatic, and then he seemed pleased." He looked at her. "I was pleased." She said, "You were pleased that I was laughing alone in my room." He said, "I was pleased that you were that comfortable in your own company. It's not a common quality." She looked at him. He looked at the fire. She said, "You know you could have knocked." He said, "I know." She said, "At any point in 2 months." He said, "I know." She said, "Bishop could have told you I would not have been upset by a knock." He said, "Bishop told me you were not ready." She stopped. She said, "He told you that." He said, "He stopped bringing items for 2 days in the 4th week. When he started again, he brought 2 items in 1 day, and he said ready when he came back." She stared at him. He said, "He tracks things, I trust his assessment." She said, "He was tracking my readiness." He said, "We both were." She pressed both hands over her face. She breathed through her hands. She was not going to laugh. She breathed again. She lowered her hands. She said, "How long has Bishop been doing this kind of thing?" He said, "He began watching people very closely about 4 years ago, after the contract dissolved." He said this without expression, in the manner of a true thing that was also old enough to be said plainly. I don't know if it was deliberate, but he stopped. He became very attentive to the question of who belonged here. She said, "And he decided I did." He said, "He decided very quickly. The items started the 2nd day." She said, "The flower was on my desk before I arrived." He said, "He put the flower there." She looked at the bird. Bishop looked at the wall. She said, "You said you didn't put the flower there." He said, "I didn't, he did." She said, "Did he do it because you wanted him to?" He looked at her carefully. He said, "I didn't ask him to." He paused, "But I didn't take it away." She looked at the wall where Bishop was looking. The wall had nothing interesting on it. She had a feeling this was not about the wall. She said, "All right." She said it in the way she had said it twice before, with different meanings, and this time the meaning was something like, "I understand more than I did before, and the understanding is fine and possibly even good." He said, "All right," back at her, in what she now recognized was his agreement to her acceptance. They sat with this for a moment. She said, "So he is definitely reporting on me." He said, "He's reporting on both of us. I believe I am also on some kind of list." She said, "What does your list have on it?" He said, "I don't know. I don't hear his reports about me." She looked at Bishop. Bishop looked at the wall. She said, "Bishop." Bishop turned and looked at her with his pale, specific, entirely reliable eyes. She said, "What do you say about him when you come to my room?" He was quiet for a moment. He said very clearly, "Good." She looked at Callum. Callum looked at Bishop with the expression that was almost a smile, and getting closer to actually one every week. She said, "That tracks." He said, "Does it?" She said, "You made me tea, you repotted my rosemary, you gave me a key instead of opening a door, you let me go first." She looked at him. "Good covers it." He said, "I thought you were going to say something about the tea." She said, "The tea is also good." He made a very quiet sound that was, she recognized with a small and private satisfaction, almost a laugh. She leaned back in the worn chair and looked at the fire. She said, "Spring is coming." He said, "Yes." She said, "The mountain will be different." He said, "Completely." She said, "Take me up to the high pass when it's clear. I want to see it from above." He was quiet for a moment, then, "Yes." "Just yes." She closed her eyes and listened to the fire and Bishop rustling his feathers and the quiet of the stronghold in the late evening. She thought about the map piece still on the shelf in the study with the other items, the pass nearest her valley, the old names on the old map. She thought about home. She was home. She had been home for some time, she thought. She had just been the last to know, and that was all right, and Bishop had been patient with her while she caught up. She opened her eyes. She looked at the gray parrot on his perch. She said, "Thank you." He ruffled once. He settled. He looked at her with his pale eyes, and she thought she had been wrong 2 months ago when she had thought his eyes were unsettling. They were not unsettling, they were just specific. They saw exactly what they looked at and they did not pretend otherwise. She looked at Callum. He was looking at her. He was not looking away. She thought about autumn and all the weeks before and after it, all the bread and silence and open doors and specific objects, and one gray feather standing in a rosemary pot. She thought, "I did not come here for simple." She did not say any of this. She did not need to. She looked at the fire. He looked at the fire. Between them, Bishop made the low, satisfied sound of something that has finished building a thing and found the foundation solid. The mountain held them all in its settled spring weight, the snow pulling back from the peaks in white threads, the air changing day by day, the kind of slow, excellent change that was not an event but a direction, and everything, in every small accumulated way, was exactly where it was supposed to be. The first week of spring also brought something Lyra had not prepared for, the return of the border envoy. Not the same man as before. A different one, younger, with the careful politeness of someone who knew the previous visit had not ended well and was working to distinguish himself from it. He arrived on a Tuesday, which she noted with the private humor of someone who had come to understand that Tuesdays at Caldenmere had a specific character. She heard about his arrival from Owen, who heard everything of social significance within approximately 4 hours of it occurring. She did not hear about it from Callum. This did not concern her. His work was his work and it was considerable, and she had not at any point expected or wanted access to the parts of it that were not her domain. She had her patients. He had his territories. The study existed in the space between those things, and she was entirely comfortable with that. What she had not expected was the evening. She came back from the east wing at her usual hour and the study door was closed, completely closed. No 3-inch gap. She stood in the corridor and noted this and went into her own room and put her bag down and changed her coat and told herself this was completely normal, and the study door being closed was an entirely ordinary thing that happened when there was a meeting or a private conversation or simply a need for a closed room. She made herself a cup of tea with the small kettle on her own shelf. She sat at her desk. She looked at the closed door. She had been in the stronghold nearly 3 months and she had developed, she now recognized, a specific dependence on the openness of that door. Not a needy dependence, not an anxious one, just the settled expectation of a thing that had become ordinary. She did not knock. She drank her tea. At the 7th hour she heard the study door to the corridor open and close. Voices brief, then quiet. 10 minutes later, 2 knocks on her door. She said, "Come in." He came in. He looked like a version of the Treaty Knight, not as bad, but the same quality, a day given fully at cost not complete. She said, "Sit down." He looked at the chair at her desk, which was not a chair designed for sitting in for any length of time, and then at the door to the study. She said, "Not here, come through." She stood and went through the study door and he followed, and she pointed at the worn chair and he sat in it, which she noted was the first time she had seen him sit in his own chair from the outside, and she thought this was significant in ways she was not going to analyze right now. She made tea. She brought it. She sat in the other chair. She did not ask about the envoy. She did not ask about the meeting or the territories or the difficult shape of the day. She said, "Did you eat?" He said, at midday. She said, I'll get something from the kitchen. He said, you don't have to. She said, I know. She went to the kitchen. Marjorie was still there, cleaning up the last of the evening preparations, and she looked at Lyra with the expression of someone who had been expecting her. She put together a plate without being asked. She did not add anything warm this time. She handed it over. She said, he's been doing that all winter, eating at midday and not again. Lyra said, I know. Marjorie said, it's not a short-term thing. He's been doing it since long before you arrived. She looked at her with the clear eyes of a woman who has been managing the physical well-being of a person from a distance for years and is relieved to have some assistance. He does better in spring, more regular habits. Lyra said, I'll track it. Marjorie said, good. She wiped down the counter. He chose well. Lyra said, he didn't exactly choose. Marjorie said, he approved your posting. Lyra said, yes. Marjorie said, he approves all postings. He's approved 37 physician's assistants in the 7 years I've worked here. She set down her cloth. He unlocked the north office door for one. She walked back into the kitchen's inner room. Lyra stood with the plate. 37. She carried the plate back through the corridor. He was still in the worn chair. Bishop was on the arm of the chair, which he had not done before in her presence, a small adjustment in Bishop's usual arrangement that meant something she interpreted as the bird being closer than usual because the person needed it. She set the plate on the side table. He ate not everything, more than he would have without it. She sat. Bishop stayed on the arm of the chair. She said, eventually, 37 physician's assistants. He looked at her. She said, Marjorie told me. He said, Marjorie talks a great deal. She said, she talks when she has something worth saying. She looked at him, 37. And you unlocked the door for one. He said, yes. She said, before you met me. He said, yes. She said, why? He was quiet for a long moment, not avoiding, just finding the exact true version of the thing. He said, because I read a posting application that documented the previous posting's failures in a way I recognized, not as a problem report, as something more honest than that, he stopped, as someone who had been paying attention to what was actually there rather than what they were supposed to see. She looked at him. He said, and I had been looking for someone like that for a long time. She said, to be the physician's assistant. He said, to be in the North Corridor. She held this. She said, that's a very long way around. He said, yes. She said, you could have introduced yourself. He said, I could have, I chose differently. She said, the door. He said, the door. She looked at Bishop on the arm of the chair. She said, and Bishop. He said, Bishop helps. She said, Bishop is his own operation. He almost smiled. He said, yes, but his operation and mine are aligned. She looked at the bird. Bishop looked at her with those pale, clear, entirely reliable eyes. She said, did you know from the beginning that I would stay? He said, Bishop knew, he told me. She said, when did he tell you? He said, 2 days after you arrived. He came back from your room and said good, and then he brought you the moon button. She breathed. She said, and you believed him. He said, I have learned to trust Bishop's assessments. She said, then why did it take 2 months? He said quietly and directly, because you needed to decide. She looked at him. He looked at her. He said, it had to be your decision, not mine, not Bishop's, yours. She said, and if I had decided differently? He said, then I would have understood, and the items would have stopped, and Bishop would have been disappointed. He paused, and I would have been, he stopped there. She waited. He said, also disappointed. She looked at the fire. She thought about the key in her pocket, the first night she had carried it, the 3 days of carrying it before she used it. She thought about the door unlocked from his side for 7 years and only now used. She said, I'm not going anywhere. He said, I know. She said, I mean that as a statement of fact, not a reassurance. He said, I understand the difference. She said, good. She picked up her cup. He picked up his. They sat by the fire while the spring evening went dark outside, and the mountain settled into its particular quality of spring night, softer than winter, full of the sound of water moving where before there had been only silence and ice. Bishop fell asleep. She looked at him asleep on the arm of the chair, and thought about all the words he knew, and all the reports he had carried between 2 rooms, and all the things he had decided and engineered and arranged with his pale specific eyes, and his tremendous patience. She said, he needs a name in the list. He said, he has a name. She said, a designation in the record, there should be a record. He looked at her. She said, I'm a physician, I document things. He said, almost entirely seriously, he would be Category 1, primary architect. She said he would not like that. He said no, he would prefer something that suggests he simply observed and that the rest followed naturally. She said, did it? He said, more or less. With some nudging. She said, considerable nudging. He said, from all sides. She thought about Edith, Corin, Gareth, Marjorie, Agnes, Owen, Dora, Cecily. She thought about all the nudging. She said, we had a great deal of help. He said, yes. She said, does that bother you? He said, it means they thought it was worth helping. He looked at the fire. I find I don't mind. She finished her tea. She was tired in the good way, the way of a day well used, and the fire was warm and the spring night was outside and Bishop was asleep, and the worn chair was exactly as comfortable as it always was. She was going to sit here for a while longer. She was in no hurry. She was not going anywhere. The morning he came to her office was not a planned morning. She knew this because she could read the shape of planned things in him now, the slight extra stillness of a person who has decided on something and is organizing around the decision. That stillness was not there when he pushed open her office door at mid-morning on a Wednesday in the last week of spring. He came in and sat in the patient's chair across from her desk. He sat in it without appearing to notice it was the patient's chair, or if he noticed, without it mattering. He put his hands on his knees and he looked at her. She looked back. She set down her pen. She said, what's happened? He said, nothing has happened. She said, you're sitting in my patient chair. He said, it's a chair. She said, it is specifically a chair that people sit in when they're about to be examined, or when they're about to tell me something difficult. He said, I'm not about to be examined. She said, then the other thing. He looked at her with the gray eyes that she had spent 3 months learning to read and had not yet exhausted, and he said, I have been trying to work out how to say something directly for several days. She said, several days. He said, I keep revising. She said, and? He said, and I've decided the revision is its own kind of avoidance. She said, what are you trying to say? He was quiet for a moment, not avoiding. Choosing. He said, this year, the past 4 months, I want you to know that I am aware of what they have been. He paused. That I do not take them as ordinary, that I do not think they are ordinary. She said, all right. He said, and I want you to know that my intention is that they continue, in whatever shape that takes, for as long as you want them to. She looked at him. He looked at her. She said, that's it. He said, there's more but I'm still revising it. She said, you've been sitting on this for several days. He said, yes. She said, and you came to tell me on a Wednesday in the middle of my patient hours. He said, I decided the revision was not serving anyone. She said, Callum. He said, yes. She said, you sent me 16 objects through a Parrot over the course of 7 weeks before you spoke to me directly. He said, yes. She said, and now you're in my patient chair on a Wednesday morning. He said, yes. She said, this is progress. He said, I thought so. She leaned forward and put both elbows on the desk and looked at him. She said, I know this is not ordinary. I have known since the first morning when I found a flower on my desk in a room that should have been empty. She looked at him steadily. And my intention is also that it continues, in whatever shape that takes, for as long as we want it to. He said, yes. She said, we don't need more revision than that. He said, no. She said, you could have sent a note. He said, I could have. She said, through Bishop. He said, Bishop suggested I come myself. She stopped. She said, he suggested it. He said go, this morning when I was in the study still revising. He said go and then he went to your door and back 3 times. He paused. I took it as a direction. She looked at the door, which was open, in the position it was always in when she was working and not seeing patients, a small permanent signal of her availability that she had been maintaining for 3 months without consciously deciding to. She said, he pushed you out of the study. He said, directed, not pushed. She said, there is a meaningful difference. He said, he thought so. From somewhere in the corridor, Bishop called once, a bright, short sound, the kind he made when he had finished something and was moving on to other business. She listened to it move down the corridor. She said, he's celebrating. He said, he's going to go tell everyone. She thought about Gareth, about Marjorie, about Owen and Agnes and Edith, all of them who had been watching and tracking and nudging from their various positions. She said, good, let him. He looked at her. She looked at him. She said, you said there was more but you were still revising it. He said, yes. She said, stop revising it. He said, it's not ready. She said, it doesn't need to be ready. He said, Lyra. She said, just say it. He looked at his hands, then at her. He said, I spent 7 years being very careful, very managed about everything, about, he stopped, he tried again, about this particular area, and I had decided I was going to remain careful. That careful was the appropriate state for someone who had made decisions of the kind I made before. He looked at the fire grate, which was unlit in the warmth of spring, just a clean space with iron and ash and the memory of winter fires. And then I read a posting application that documented failures the way a person documents them when they are genuinely paying attention, and I unlocked a door. She said, and? He said, and it was the first non-careful thing I had done in 7 years. She said, and? He said, and I find that I would like to be less careful, in the general direction of you, specifically. She sat with this. She said, you're asking. He said, I'm telling you, there's a difference. She said, yes, there is. She looked at him for a long moment. She thought about the list in his handwriting that she had put in her coat pocket, the list she still had, the list that ended with, brought me bread when I couldn't eat and sat beside me and didn't say anything that needed saying. She thought about the moon button on his desk. She thought about the worn chair and the tea and the open door, and all the small ordinaries of a thing that had been growing for months in the careful, unhurried way of things that take root rather than things that arrive. She said, I would like that too. He said, yes. She said, yes. He breathed out just once, just briefly, the breath of someone who has been holding something for a while. She stood up. She went around the desk. She held out her hand. He looked at it, he took it, not shaking it. Just holding it, the way you hold something you are not planning to set back down immediately. She said, come and see my rosemary. He said, I know how the rosemary is doing. She said, come and see it anyway. She led him out of the patient's chair and through the office door and into the north corridor, which was quiet in the mid-morning, the mountain light coming through the end window in the particular clear spring way that had replaced the winter's gray. She pushed open her door and walked in and stood at the shelf. The rosemary was substantial now. It had doubled since the repotting. It sat in its large new pot in the morning light with the bowl of water beside it, and the gray feather she had kept standing in the soil like a marker, and it smelled clean and strong and exactly like itself. He stood beside her. He looked at the rosemary. She looked at it too. She said, you could not have put this on my desk. He said, no, Bishop can't carry a pot. She said, so you arranged it through Corin. He said, the corridor humidity is wrong in winter. It needed management. She said, you were managing my plant. He said, you were keeping it alive. I was keeping the conditions right. He paused. It's a division of responsibility. She said, there will be more divisions of responsibility, I assume. He said, many. She said, I'm good at those. He said, I know, I have a list. She smiled, she could not help it. She pressed her free hand over her mouth and she breathed, and the smile settled into something quieter and more permanent. She said, "I have a list too." He said, "I know, Bishop told me about the blue notebook." She said, "What did he say about it?" He said, "Counting." She said, "That's all." He said, "He also said good at some point. I wasn't sure what he meant by it at the time." She said, "He meant all of it." He said, "Yes, I understand that now." She turned and looked at him directly. He was looking at the rosemary still, or pretending to, with the expression she knew was the one where he was thinking about something else. She said, "What are you thinking?" He said that I unlocked a door in autumn and it took until spring, and now it's spring, and Bishop is somewhere in the stronghold telling everyone, and the rosemary is substantial, and you have a blue notebook full of evidence. She said, "Yes." He said, "And I am less careful than I was." She said, "Yes." He said, "And I find I don't miss it." She said, "The carefulness." He said, "The alone." She held his hand. He held hers. Through the north window at the end of the corridor, the mountain showed itself in the full spring morning, white above and green beginning below, the peaks clean against a sky that had decided at last to be unambiguously blue. Bishop arrived on the windowsill outside her room. He looked in through the glass, he looked at them, he looked at the rosemary, he looked back at them. He said very clearly through the glass, "About time." Then he ate part of the wooden window frame, which he had apparently been wanting to do for some time, and the moment broke apart entirely, not into nothing but into something better, the two of them looking at the bird and then at each other, and the thing in both their faces that was not quite a smile being both of their faces, fully at the same time, genuine and without management. She laughed. He laughed. Not at each other. With each other, at a bird who had spent 4 months carrying objects between rooms and reporting on 2 people who were too careful to begin, and had finally decided to be less careful, simultaneously, in a patient chair on a Wednesday morning in the last week of spring. She looked at Callum. He looked at her. Outside, Bishop inspected the window frame. She said, "He's going to ruin the wood." He said, "He does that." She said, "Someone should stop him." He said, "Probably." Neither of them moved. She looked at the room around her, the rosemary on the shelf, the empty desk where the row of objects had been, now on a shelf in the study where they belonged, the open door between the rooms, the blue notebook on the corner of the desk with the dark blue cover and the medical term on the spine that meant something only to her. She thought about the first morning, the bag on the floor, the held breath quiet, the flower in the center of the desk. She thought about all of it. She was going to need to get a larger shelf in the study, eventually. The items were going to keep accumulating, she suspected, because that was apparently how this person showed things, through small accumulated presences, through objects carried by a bird, through unlocked doors and blank pages and precise handwriting and 3 words at midnight that asked if she had slept. She was, she decided, entirely at peace with this. She looked at the blue notebook. She thought about opening it, writing something in it. She thought about what she would write. She thought, "I don't need to write it down." She knew where she was. She knew exactly where she was. The mountain was clear above the stronghold walls, and the spring was coming up through the valley below, and Bishop said something from the window that was not a word but sounded, in his particular way, like satisfaction, and she stood in the north corridor office that was hers and had always been hers since the day it was aired and its shelf was restocked, and its door was unlocked by a man who did not know how to begin but had begun anyway in the smallest possible way, and she held his hand. She was home. She had been home for some time. She just knew it fully now. And outside on the window ledge, Bishop looked at them both with his pale, reliable, completely unapologetic eyes and turned to face the mountain. And the morning went on around them all in exactly the way morning goes on when everything that was supposed to happen has happened, in exactly the order it was supposed to happen in, without anyone explaining it, and without anything being left unfinished. The rosemary grew. The door stayed open. The notebook stayed closed. She went to the east wing that afternoon, and she was exactly what she always was, precise and present and genuinely interested in the people in front of her. She checked 3 patients. She updated 2 files. She had a long conversation with Edith about a new treatment protocol she had been developing for repetitive strain injuries among the guards, and Edith listened with the attention of a woman who recognized good thinking and said at the end, "Write it up and I'll review it this week." She wrote it up that evening in the study, because the desk in the study was larger and the light was better, and Callum was at the other end of the desk with his own paperwork, and Bishop was on his perch, and the fire was burning low in the way of spring fires that did not need to be large but were there for the comfort rather than the heat. She finished the protocol draft, she set it aside. She looked at the shelf where the items were arranged. She looked at the row of them, all 15 plus the key, plus the things that had come after and could not be put on a shelf, the nights by the fire and the bread and salt and the open door, and the list in her coat pocket and Callum's almost smiles and Bishop's considerable vocabulary. She thought, I should add something to the shelf. She went to her room, she got the blue notebook from the desk, she brought it back into the study. She put it on the shelf at the end of the row of items. Callum looked up. She said, "It goes with the collection." He said, "There are personal observations in that notebook." She said, "I know." He looked at her. She said, "You gave me the key. I'm giving you the notebook." He said, "I didn't read the key." She said, "The key doesn't have personal observations in it." He said, "Lyra." She said, "You can read it or not, that's yours to decide." He looked at the notebook on the shelf, he looked at her. He said, "You documented this, all of it." She said, "I document anomalies, it's what I do." He said, "Were we an anomaly?" She said, "Initially." He said, "And then?" She said, "And then you were the only thing in the notebook." He was quiet. She went back to the desk and picked up the protocol draft. He said, "I'm not going to read it." She said, "That's your choice." He said, "Not because I don't want to." She set the draft down, she looked at him. He said, "Because some things should stay inside the person who thought them, even if they're offered." He looked at the notebook on the shelf. "I know what's in it. Bishop told me in pieces over 4 months. I know you counted things. I know you wrote about the flour and the door and the bread." He paused. "I know you wrote I'm going to stay before I knew you had decided." She said, "When did Bishop tell you that?" He said, "The next morning. He came into the study and said stay and seemed very settled about it." She breathed. She said, "He told you before I told you?" He said, "Yes." She said, "Did you tell him things too, to take to me?" He said, "I told him things. I don't know what he chose to pass on." She looked at the bird. Bishop looked at the notebook. She said, "What did you tell him?" Callum looked at the desk. He said that I was not going to make the same mistake twice, that I was going to wait until you decided that I found it. He stopped. He tried again. That I found the specific quality of your attention unusual in a very good way. She said, "The specific quality of my attention." He said, "You pay attention differently than most people. You pay attention as if the thing you're looking at matters, as if it always has, even if you've only just found it." She looked at him. He met her eyes. He said, "It is a good quality to be on the receiving end of." She said, "Is that what you told Bishop?" He said, "That and other things." She said, "What did he do with it?" He said, "He went to your room and sat on your windowsill for a while. Then he came back and said good." She said, "He was telling you I was going to be fine." He said, "Yes, he was also," he paused, "telling me something about myself." She said, "That you were going to be fine." He said, "Yes." She looked at the shelf with the notebook beside the moon button. She said, "We should add to the collection." He said, "What would we add?" She said, "Something new, something that's not from before." He was quiet for a moment. Then he stood up, he went to the shelf. He picked up the moon button, which she had put there but which had originally been his, and he held it for a moment the way she had held it for 3 months, turning it over, finding the crescent curve against his thumb. He set it back on the shelf. He picked up the notebook. He held it for a moment. He set it back. He said, "It's all here already." She said, "Yes." He said, "We don't need to add anything." She said, "No." He came back to the desk. He sat down, he looked at his paperwork. She looked at hers. After a moment he said, "The high pass will be clear by next week. The scouts confirmed it today." She looked up. He said, "You wanted to see it from above." She said, "Yes." He said, "Next week." She said, "Yes." She went back to the protocol draft. He went back to his paperwork. Bishop fell asleep on his perch. The fire burned down. Neither of them moved to add logs this time, because the spring evening was warm enough without it, and the study held its own warmth now from the fire and the books and the months of evenings spent in it, and everything was exactly as it needed to be. She finished the protocol draft. She set her pen down. She looked around the study, the books in their particular logic, the worn chair, the desk with its ring from years of evening cups of tea, the shelf with 15 items and a key and a blue notebook. She thought about the first morning, the door Corin had unlocked with a key, the room barely large enough for a bed and a desk and a shelf. The flower placed in the center, deliberate and patient and present before she arrived. She thought about 3 words in precise handwriting, "Have you slept?" She thought about 1 word from a gray parrot, "Good." She said to the room, to the desk, to the man across from her working through his evening papers, to the sleeping bird and the spring night and the mountain outside the window, "I am very glad I documented things." He did not look up, but he said quietly, "So am I." She picked up the protocol draft. She was going to need to make a copy, 1 for Edith and 1 for the records room, and she was going to need to update 2 patient files before morning, and she was going to need to water the rosemary before she went to bed. She did all of these things. She went to bed late, and she slept all the way through, and in the morning the mountain was clear above the spring sky and the rosemary was growing and the door between the rooms was open and a gray parrot was already on her windowsill, looking at the day with his pale specific eyes, deciding in his particular way what it required of him. She opened the window. He stepped in. She said, "Good morning, Bishop." He said, "Good." She thought that covered it. She went to work.